The paradox of identity asks a simple but profound question. What makes something the same over time? On the surface, this seems straightforward. A chair is still a chair tomorrow, and a person remains the same person from one day to the next. But when you look deeper, identity becomes far more complex. Objects change, people grow. Even the smallest shift in shape, function, or thought raises the question, is it still the same? Imagine a wooden ship that has been at sea for years. Over time, some of its planks rot and are replaced with new ones. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. This process continues until every single plank has been swapped out. Is it still the same ship? This is the classic ship of Theseus thought experiment. Some say it is the same ship because the process was gradual, and it still serves the same purpose. Others argue it is no longer the same because none of the original materials remain. The paradox deepens if you collect all the old planks and reassemble them into another ship. Now, which is the original? The one still afloat, or the one rebuilt from the old pieces? This problem is not limited to ships. It applies to everything, including people. Consider yourself. The cells in your body are constantly dying and being replaced. By some estimates, nearly every cell in your body is replaced over the span of 7 to 10 years. If your physical body is entirely new, are you still the same person? Most people would say yes, because your memories, personality, and sense of self remain intact. But memories and personality can change too. What happens when someone experiences memory loss or a dramatic shift in behavior? Are they still the same individual they once were? Another example is the modern issue of artificial replacements. Imagine a person who slowly replaces parts of their body with advanced prosthetics or synthetic organs. If they replace one arm, they are still the same person. But what if they replace both arms, then both legs, and eventually even their heart? If the brain remains the same, most would agree they are still the same person. But if the brain is gradually replaced with artificial parts, at what point do they stop being human? If the entire body and brain are eventually replaced, is the person still the same, or have they become something entirely different? The paradox also applies to objects. Think about a family heirloom, like a chair passed down through generations. Over time, pieces of the chair wear out and are repaired. A leg breaks and is replaced. The cushion is reupholstered. Eventually, every part of the chair is swapped out. Is it still the same heirloom? To the family, it might be, because the meaning and memories attached to it remain. But to an outsider, it might look like an entirely different chair. This tension between material reality and emotional significance is at the heart of the paradox. The paradox of identity becomes even more challenging when applied to ideas. Take a book, for example. If you rewrite a novel one chapter at a time, adding new details and changing old ones, at what point does it become a new book? Or consider a country. Borders change, governments rise and fall, and populations shift, yet people continue to refer to it by the same name. Is it still the same country? In both cases, identity is tied to continuity and function rather than material sameness. This tension between physical change and continuity is why identity is so difficult to define. Some philosophers argue that identity is about persistence through time. As long as there is a clear connection between the past and the present, something remains the same. For example, a river is never made of the same water, but we call it the same river because its flow and location remain consistent. This view emphasizes the process and purpose over the material. Others argue that identity is rooted in the material or the original components. They would say the ship of Theseus ceases to be the same ship once all its parts are replaced. Similarly, a person who replaces their entire body and brain might no longer be the same person. This view focuses on the physical reality of what something is made of, rather than its continuity over time. In some cases, identity depends on perspective. For example, a classic car restored with entirely new parts might be considered the same car by its owner, but not by a collector looking for originality. A musician performing under the same band name, even after all the original members have left, might still be seen as the same band by fans, but not by critics. These examples show how identity is often shaped by context and interpretation rather than objective facts. The paradox of identity has practical implications. In medicine, for instance, debates arise about what defines a person in cases of severe brain injury or advanced dementia. If someone loses their memories and personality, are they still the same individual? This question influences decisions about care, autonomy, and even legal responsibility. In technology, the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning raises questions about whether machines can develop identities. If a computer program evolves over time, at what point does it become something new? The paradox also challenges our understanding of ourselves. Most people think of their identity as stable and unchanging, but this is an illusion. People grow and adapt constantly. The person you are today is not the same as the person you were 10 years ago. Your values, beliefs, and preferences evolve with time and experience, yet you still think of yourself as you. This continuity is a product of memory and narrative. You create a story about who you are, connecting your past, present, and future into a coherent whole. This story helps you navigate life, even if the details change over time. At its core, the paradox of identity forces us to confront the fluid nature of existence. Nothing remains completely the same, yet we cling to the idea of permanence. This tension is part of what makes life so rich and complex. It reminds us that identity is not a fixed property, but a process. Whether it's a ship, a person, or an idea, identity is shaped by continuity, function, and perception. Understanding this can help us appreciate the beauty of change while still valuing the connections that give meaning to our lives. In the end, the paradox of identity does not have a clear resolution. It challenges us to think deeply about what makes something or someone the same over time. Whether we focus on material components, continuity, or perspective, the answer will always depend on context. This lack of certainty is what makes the paradox so compelling. It reveals the complexity of the world and our struggle to make sense of it. And perhaps that struggle in itself is part of what defines us. Imagine a machine that can give you the perfect life. Once you step inside, you're connected to a system that stimulates your brain in a way that feels completely real. It creates a world where everything goes exactly the way you want. You experience happiness, success, and fulfillment without the challenges or pain of the real world. This is the premise of the experience machine, a thought experiment introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick. It asks a simple but profound question. If you could plug into such a machine, would you? At first, the idea sounds appealing. Who wouldn't want a perfect life? The machine can give you any experience you desire. You could feel the joy of achieving your biggest dreams, whether it's becoming a world-renowned artist, exploring the stars, or finding true love. In this virtual reality, everything feels just as real as it does outside the machine. You wouldn't know you were connected to it. For all you're aware, this perfect life is your reality. The only decision you have to make is whether to step inside. But something about this choice feels unsettling. If everything is perfect, why hesitate? The machine guarantees happiness, so shouldn't it be an obvious decision? Yet, for many people, the idea of plugging in doesn't sit right. There's a nagging sense that something important would be lost. But what exactly would that be? One concern is authenticity. When you're in the machine, the experiences aren't real. Sure, they feel real, but they're not. If you win an Olympic gold medal in the machine, you didn't actually train for it or compete. The machine made you feel like you did, but the achievement isn't genuine. Many people value authenticity in their lives. They want their accomplishments to be earned, not handed to them by a device. This makes the idea of living in the machine less appealing. It's like the difference between climbing a mountain yourself and being flown to the top. The view might be the same, but the experience is fundamentally different. Another issue is the loss of connection to the real world. In the machine, you're alone. The people you interact with aren't real, they're simulations. They might seem like friends or family, but they're not truly there. In the real world, relationships are built through shared experiences, trust, and vulnerability. These connections give life meaning. If you're in the machine, those connections disappear. Even if the machine makes you feel loved, it's not the same as being loved by a real person. There's also the question of personal growth. Life is full of challenges, and those challenges shape who you are. Struggling with failure, overcoming obstacles, and learning from mistakes are all part of being human. They build resilience, empathy, and wisdom. In the machine, those struggles don't exist. Everything goes your way, so you never have to grow or adapt. While this might sound pleasant, it raises the question of whether you can truly appreciate happiness without experiencing hardship. Is a life without challenges really fulfilling, or does it lose some of its depth? The experience machine also brings up questions about freedom. When you're in the machine, your life is pre-programmed. You're not making real choices because the machine is deciding everything for you. Even though it feels like you're in control, you're not. This loss of agency is troubling to many people. Part of what makes life meaningful is the ability to make decisions and shape your own path. In the machine, that freedom is an illusion. Some argue that plugging into the machine would be selfish. While you're living a perfect life, the real world continues. Problems like poverty, injustice, and environmental destruction still exist, but you're no longer part of the solution. By choosing the machine, you're choosing to ignore those issues and focus only on your own happiness. For people who find meaning in helping others, this would make the machine an unacceptable choice. On the other hand, there are those who argue that plugging into the machine isn't all that different from how we already live. People pursue pleasure, success, and happiness in their everyday lives. They seek out entertainment, relationships, and achievements to feel fulfilled. If the machine provides those things more effectively, why not use it? If happiness is the ultimate goal, the machine seems like a shortcut to achieving it. But happiness might not be the only goal. Nozick's thought experiment suggests that people value more than just feeling good. They value reality, growth, connection, and freedom. These things can involve discomfort, pain, and struggle, but they also bring meaning to life. The machine eliminates the bad, but it also takes away the good that comes from overcoming adversity and engaging with the real world. It replaces genuine experiences with artificial ones, and for many, that trade-off is too steep. The thought experiment doesn't have a right or wrong answer. It's designed to make you think about what matters most to you. Is happiness enough, or do you need something more? Would you choose a perfect illusion over an imperfect reality? The experience machine forces us to confront these questions and examine our values. Even if you decide not to plug into the machine, the idea challenges you to think about how you live your life. Are you chasing experiences that feel good in the moment but lack real substance? Are you prioritizing authenticity, growth, and connection, even when they're difficult? The machine might not exist, but the choices it represents are very real. Ultimately, the experience machine highlights the complexity of human desires. We want happiness, but we also want meaning. We want comfort, but we also want challenge. We want control, but we also want spontaneity. Life is a balancing act between these competing desires, and the thought experiment reminds us that there are no easy answers. Whether or not you would plug into the machine, thinking about it can help you clarify what truly matters in your life. The Münchhausen Trilemma is a philosophical concept that explores the difficulty of proving anything with absolute certainty. It asks a fundamental question: how do we justify the reasons we give for what we believe? At first glance, it might seem like a simple problem to solve. You might think that if you provide good reasons for your belief, then the belief is justified. But when you dig deeper, the process of justification becomes more complicated. The Münchhausen Trilemma points out that any attempt to justify a belief inevitably leads to one of three unsatisfying outcomes: circular reasoning, infinite regress, or an arbitrary assumption. To understand this better, let's start with the name. The term Münchhausen refers to Baron Münchhausen, a fictional character known for telling exaggerated and impossible stories. One of his most famous tales describes how he pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair, or in some versions, by his own bootstraps. The story is, of course, absurd, because no one can lift themselves by their own bootstraps. Yet the idea of attempting the impossible is at the heart of this trilemma. The trilemma suggests that trying to justify knowledge is like trying to pull yourself out of a swamp without any external help. It's a task doomed to fail. Now, let's break down the three options that the trilemma presents. The first is circular reasoning. In this case, you justify a belief by using another belief that eventually leads back to the original belief. For example, imagine someone says, "I know my friend always tells the truth because they said they do." This reasoning is circular because the statement depends on itself for validation. Circular reasoning might feel convincing in the moment, but it doesn't provide any real foundation. It's like walking in a circle and expecting to arrive at a new destination. The second option is infinite regress. This happens when every justification requires another justification, creating an endless chain. Imagine a child asking their parent why the sky is blue. The parent might say, "Because light from the sun scatters in the atmosphere." The child then asks, "Why does light scatter?" The parent explains further, and the child continues to ask why after each answer. While each response may be valid, the process could go on forever. Infinite regress might seem more rigorous than circular reasoning, but it has its own problem. It never provides a final answer. Without a stopping point, the chain of justification is incomplete, leaving the original belief unsupported. The third option is an arbitrary assumption. This means stopping the chain of justification by accepting something as true without proof. For example, someone might say, "The sky is blue because that's just the way it is." This approach avoids circular reasoning and infinite regress, but it relies on accepting a statement without evidence. Arbitrary assumptions are often unsatisfying because they feel like a dead end. They provide no deeper understanding of why something is true. The Münchhausen Trilemma argues that every attempt to justify a belief will end in one of these three outcomes. No matter how hard we try, we can't escape the trilemma. This realization has significant implications for philosophy, science, and even everyday life. It challenges the idea that we can ever achieve absolute certainty about anything. In science, for example, we rely on observations and experiments to justify our understanding of the world. But scientific theories are based on assumptions, like the idea that the laws of nature are consistent over time. We can test these assumptions, but even those tests depend on other assumptions. The trilemma suggests that science, while incredibly powerful, is ultimately built on foundations that cannot be fully justified. This doesn't mean science is unreliable, it just means that absolute certainty is out of reach. In philosophy, the trilemma highlights the difficulty of defining knowledge. Philosophers often describe knowledge as justified true belief, meaning that for something to count as knowledge, it must be true, and you must have good reasons for believing it. But the Münchhausen Trilemma complicates this definition. If every justification eventually leads to circular reasoning, infinite regress, or an arbitrary assumption, can we ever truly justify a belief? This question has led some philosophers to embrace skepticism, the idea that we cannot know anything with certainty. Even in everyday life, the trilemma plays a role. Think about debates or arguments where someone demands proof for a claim. At some point, every argument reaches a point where no further justification is possible. For example, if someone asks why stealing is wrong, you might say, because it harms others. If they then ask why harming others is wrong, you might respond, because we should treat others with respect. But if they ask why respect is important, you might struggle to provide a deeper answer. Eventually, the justification will rely on a value or assumption that cannot be proven. Does this mean we should give up on trying to justify our beliefs? Not necessarily. While the trilemma shows that absolute certainty is unattainable, it doesn't mean that all beliefs are equally valid. Some justifications are stronger than others, even if they aren't perfect. In science, for instance, theories are judged by how well they explain observations and predict future outcomes. While we can't justify these theories with absolute certainty, we can evaluate them based on their usefulness and reliability. Similarly, in philosophy, the trilemma encourages us to examine our assumptions and think critically about our beliefs. By acknowledging the limits of justification, we can approach knowledge with humility and openness. This doesn't mean abandoning beliefs altogether. It means recognizing that they are always provisional, subject to change as we learn more. In practical terms, the Münchhausen Trilemma reminds us that seeking certainty is not always the best goal. Instead, we can focus on finding the most reasonable or coherent explanations available. For example, in a court of law, decisions are made based on evidence and arguments, not absolute proof. While the legal system acknowledges that mistakes can happen, it operates on the principle of reaching the best possible conclusion based on the available information. The trilemma also teaches us to be mindful of the limitations of our reasoning. When engaging in debates or discussions, it's important to recognize when an argument relies on circular reasoning, infinite regress, or arbitrary assumptions. By identifying these patterns, we can evaluate arguments more effectively and avoid being misled. Ultimately, the Münchhausen Trilemma is a reminder of the complexity of knowledge and the limits of human understanding. It challenges us to think deeply about how we justify our beliefs and to accept that some questions may never have definitive answers. While this might seem unsettling, it can also be liberating. By letting go of the need for absolute certainty, we can embrace curiosity, explore new ideas, and continue the never-ending quest for understanding. The trilemma doesn't close the door on knowledge, it opens the door to deeper inquiry. The problem of evil is one of the oldest and most debated questions in philosophy and theology. It asks how a benevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient God can coexist with the presence of evil and suffering in the world. This question has puzzled thinkers for centuries, as it raises profound challenges to our understanding of morality, free will, and the nature of the divine. If God is all-loving, it seems logical that he would want to eliminate suffering. If he is all-powerful, he would have the ability to do so. And if he is all-knowing, he would be aware of all suffering. Yet suffering persists. This apparent contradiction forms the heart of the problem. To make this clearer, consider a specific example. Imagine a natural disaster, such as an earthquake, that devastates an entire region. Thousands of people die, including children and those who had no role in causing the event. Survivors are left homeless, grieving, and struggling to rebuild their lives. If God is both loving and capable, why would he allow such an event to happen? For many, this type of scenario serves as evidence that either God does not exist or that he is not as loving or powerful as religious texts claim. Some theologians argue that evil and suffering exist because of free will. This is known as the free will defense. According to this view, God gave humans free will so they could make their own choices. While free will allows for love, kindness, and creativity, it also opens the door to selfishness, cruelty, and harm. God, they argue, does not intervene because doing so would take away the very freedom that makes us human. Without free will, humans would be little more than robots, incapable of genuine relationships or moral growth. Evil, in this view, is a consequence of the freedom God gave us. While the free will defense explains moral evil, such as acts of violence or cruelty committed by humans, it does not fully account for natural evil. Natural evil refers to suffering caused by events beyond human control, like earthquakes, hurricanes, or diseases. Why would a loving God create a world where such suffering is possible? One answer is that natural disasters and diseases are part of the natural order of the universe. The Earth's tectonic plates shift, creating earthquakes, but this same process also makes life possible by shaping the planet's surface. Diseases evolve through natural selection, but this same process drives the diversity of life on Earth. In this view, suffering is an unavoidable consequence of the physical laws that make life possible. Some argue that suffering serves a greater purpose, even if we cannot always understand it. This perspective is known as the soul-making theodicy. According to this view, challenges and hardships help us grow spiritually and morally. Facing adversity can teach compassion, resilience, and humility. For example, a person who survives a difficult illness might develop a deeper appreciation for life or a stronger sense of empathy for others. From this perspective, suffering is not meaningless. It is part of a larger plan designed to shape us into better beings. However, this explanation raises further questions. If suffering is meant to teach us something, why do some people experience far more suffering than others? And what about instances of suffering that seem utterly pointless, such as the death of an innocent child? It is difficult to see how such tragedies could contribute to soul-making. Critics argue that this defense often feels inadequate in the face of immense and senseless suffering. Another perspective suggests that our understanding of God's actions is limited by our human perspective. This is known as the greater good defense. According to this view, God's ways are beyond human comprehension. What appears to us as unnecessary suffering might serve a purpose we cannot see. For example, an event that seems tragic might lead to positive changes in the long run, or it might play a role in a divine plan that we cannot fully grasp. This argument relies on the idea that humans have a limited view of reality, while God sees the bigger picture. Critics of this view argue that it asks for too much faith. If we cannot understand God's reasons, how can we be sure that those reasons are just? Furthermore, the idea that suffering might serve a hidden purpose can feel deeply unsatisfying to those who are experiencing pain. It is difficult to find comfort in the idea of a greater good when one is faced with personal tragedy. For atheists and skeptics, the problem of evil is often seen as evidence against the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God. They argue that the simplest explanation for the existence of evil is that there is no divine being controlling the universe. Instead, the world operates according to natural laws, and suffering is a consequence of those laws. In this view, earthquakes happen because of tectonic activity, not because of any divine purpose. Diseases spread because of biological processes, not because of a test of faith or character. While this perspective removes the problem of reconciling God with evil, it raises other questions, such as how we find meaning in a world without divine oversight. Religious believers often respond to these challenges by pointing out the limits of human understanding. They argue that faith is about trusting in God even when his actions seem incomprehensible. For many, faith provides comfort in the face of suffering, offering the hope of a better future or an afterlife where justice will be restored. This perspective emphasizes the importance of trust and humility in the face of life's mysteries. The problem of evil remains one of the most complex and enduring questions in philosophy and theology. It challenges our assumptions about the nature of God, the purpose of suffering, and the limits of human understanding. While there is no definitive answer, the debate itself has deepened our understanding of morality, free will, and the human condition. Whether one sees suffering as a test of faith, a consequence of natural laws, or simply a part of life, the problem of evil forces us to grapple with some of the most profound questions about existence. The unexpected gift paradox is a fascinating puzzle about surprise and expectations. It challenges the way we think about surprises and how we process information. At first glance, the idea seems straightforward. You are told you will receive a surprise gift at some point during the week. The key to the gift is that it must be unexpected. But as you start to think about when the surprise might happen, the paradox begins to unravel itself. To understand how the paradox works, imagine being told on Sunday evening that you will receive the surprise gift on one day between Monday and Friday. However, you are told it will happen on a day when you least expect it. Naturally, you start to think through the possibilities. First, you consider Friday. If the surprise hasn't happened by Thursday evening, you might conclude that it must happen on Friday. But if you expect it on Friday, it can no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Friday is ruled out. Now that Friday is eliminated, you turn to Thursday. If the surprise hasn't come by Wednesday evening, you might conclude that it must happen on Thursday. But just like before, if you expect it on Thursday, it's no longer a surprise. So Thursday must also be ruled out. This same reasoning applies to Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday. By the end of this thought process, it seems impossible for the gift to be a surprise on any day. Here's where the paradox really takes hold. Despite this logical reasoning, the surprise can still occur. Let's say it happens on Wednesday. On Tuesday night, you might have ruled out Wednesday as a possibility based on the logic you followed earlier. But when the surprise happens on Wednesday, you are genuinely caught off guard. The paradox lies in the tension between your reasoning and the actual event. Even though you think you've eliminated all possibilities, the surprise still works. What makes this paradox so intriguing is how it challenges our assumptions about logic and expectations. The key to the puzzle is in the phrase, least expect. The idea of a surprise hinges on the fact that you cannot fully anticipate it, but as soon as you try to reason through when it might happen, you introduce an expectation, which complicates the very idea of being surprised. This paradox has deeper implications than it may seem at first. It reveals the limits of logical reasoning when applied to certain kinds of situations. Logical deduction assumes that we can predict outcomes based on available information, but surprises, by their nature, defy prediction. The unexpected gift paradox highlights how our efforts to anticipate something can sometimes undermine the experience itself. It also shows how language and the way we interpret it plays a central role in shaping our expectations. The paradox can be extended to other situations beyond the idea of a gift. Consider the scenario of a surprise test in a classroom. A teacher tells students that there will be a surprise test sometime during the week. The same reasoning applies. If the test hasn't happened by Thursday night, the students might assume it will occur on Friday, making it no longer a surprise. By this logic, the test can't happen on any day. Yet when the test actually takes place, perhaps on Wednesday, the students are genuinely surprised. This version of the paradox is often called the unexpected exam paradox, and it follows the same principles. One way to think about this puzzle is to examine how humans process uncertainty. When faced with an unpredictable situation, we often try to create certainty by analyzing possibilities. We eliminate options, narrow the field, and draw conclusions based on what we know. But surprises operate in a space where information is incomplete or deliberately obscured. The more we try to predict a surprise, the harder it becomes to let the surprise happen naturally. This is the trap of the unexpected gift paradox. The more you try to predict, the more your reasoning gets tangled in its own contradictions. The paradox also raises questions about how much we trust the information we're given. When someone tells you that a surprise will happen, do you fully believe them? Or do you start to second-guess their words, thinking they might not follow through? This element of trust adds another layer to the puzzle. If you doubt the statement, you may dismiss the possibility of the surprise altogether, which changes how you approach the situation. On the other hand, if you take the statement at face value, you find yourself caught in the loop of overthinking every possible outcome. Another way to explore the paradox is to think about how it mirrors real-life experiences. Many of life's surprises come when we aren't actively looking for them. For example, you might receive an unexpected call from an old friend, stumble upon a beautiful place during a walk, or find an answer to a problem when you least expect it. These moments are surprising precisely because you weren't trying to anticipate them. The unexpected gift paradox captures this dynamic by showing how deliberate attempts to predict a surprise often backfire. Despite its playful nature, this paradox has been studied by philosophers and logicians for decades. It touches on fundamental issues in epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of what we can know and how we can know it. Can we ever be certain of a surprise, or does the very concept of certainty eliminate the possibility of being surprised? These questions reveal the deeper philosophical roots of the puzzle. The paradox also has practical applications in areas like game theory and decision-making. In competitive situations, anticipating the actions of others often leads to similar loops of reasoning. If one player tries to predict the other's move, they might overthink and misjudge the situation. Understanding the dynamics of the unexpected gift paradox can help in recognizing when overanalysis becomes counterproductive. Ultimately, the beauty of the unexpected gift paradox lies in its simplicity and its depth. On the surface, it's a lighthearted puzzle about surprise and timing. But as you dig deeper, it reveals profound truths about human reasoning, expectations, and the nature of surprise itself. The paradox invites us to embrace uncertainty and accept that not everything can be anticipated or explained. Sometimes, the best way to experience a surprise is to stop trying to figure it out and simply let it happen. The drinker's paradox is a logic puzzle that seems absurd at first glance, but makes perfect sense upon closer examination. It states that in any bar, there is at least one person, such that if that person drinks, everyone else in the bar drinks as well. This statement feels counterintuitive, almost ridiculous, but it is a valid logical conclusion based on how it is structured. To understand the drinker's paradox, it's essential to break it down step by step, examining how logic operates in this case and why such a surprising statement holds true. To begin, it's important to recognize that the paradox relies on a basic principle of formal logic, specifically the idea of implications. In logic, a statement of the form, if A, then B, is considered true unless A is true and B is false. This means that even if A never happens, the statement as a whole is still true. For example, take the statement, if it rains tomorrow, I will stay indoors. If it doesn't rain tomorrow, the statement is still true because the condition for testing it, rain, never occurs. This idea is central to understanding the drinker's paradox because the paradox hinges on how implications function, not on the practical realities of drinking behavior. Now, imagine a bar filled with people. Some are drinking, some are not. The claim is that there is at least one person in the bar, such that if that person drinks, everyone else drinks too. To illustrate, let's consider two scenarios. In the first, everyone in the bar is already drinking. In this case, the paradox is easily satisfied because the condition is trivially true. If everyone is drinking, you can pick any person in the bar, and the statement holds, if this person drinks, everyone drinks. Since everyone is already drinking, the condition is met without complication. The second scenario is more interesting. Not everyone in the bar is drinking. Perhaps some people are drinking and others are not. At first, it might seem impossible to find a person who satisfies the paradox, but the key lies in how the logical structure works. Consider one person who is not drinking. Let's call them Alex. The statement, if Alex drinks, everyone else drinks, is still logically valid because Alex is not drinking. Since the condition of Alex drinking is not met, the statement cannot be proven false, and it remains true by default. This is the counterintuitive part of the paradox. As long as the condition, Alex drinking, doesn't happen, the statement is logically satisfied. The drinker's paradox forces us to think about the difference between practical scenarios and logical ones. In real life, we might try to connect cause and effect, asking, how could one person's drinking influence everyone else in the bar? But the paradox is not concerned with causation. It only cares about the logical relationship between conditions. Whether or not people in the bar actually influence one another is irrelevant. What matters is that the statement, if this person drinks, then everyone drinks, can never be proven false, even if it feels strange or unrealistic. To make this even clearer, let's take a different example that follows the same logical structure. Imagine a park with a group of people. Someone claims there is at least one person in the park, such that if they clap their hands, everyone else claps too. This might sound impossible, but the logic holds. If no one claps, the condition is satisfied because the person's clapping never occurs, so the statement remains true by default. If everyone is already clapping, the condition is also satisfied. In either case, the logic checks out, even if the scenario feels disconnected from reality. The paradox is not just a playful puzzle. It also highlights how formal logic can produce results that seem counterintuitive. In everyday thinking, we often rely on intuition or practical reasoning, which can lead us to reject statements like the drinker's paradox as nonsensical. However, logic operates on strict rules that don't always align with our natural instincts. By examining cases like this one, we can see how logic follows its own internal consistency, even when the conclusions seem strange. The drinker's paradox also invites reflection on how we interpret language and reasoning. In natural language, statements often carry implied context or assumptions. For example, if someone says, if I win the lottery, I'll buy a car, we might assume they're talking about a realistic situation where they could win. But in formal logic, the statement is true even if they never buy a ticket. The drinker's paradox strips away these assumptions and forces us to engage with the raw mechanics of logical implication. It challenges us to think carefully about what we mean when we say something is true or false. One of the reasons the drinker's paradox is so intriguing is that it can apply to any situation where implications are involved. It doesn't have to be about drinking in a bar. The same reasoning applies to any condition paired with a universal statement. For instance, you could say, in any classroom, there is at least one student such that if they stand up, everyone else stands too. The structure is identical, and the logical conclusion remains valid. The specific details don't matter. What matters is how the logic is constructed. In philosophy, paradoxes like this one are useful tools for exploring the limits of reasoning. They show how logic can produce unexpected results and help clarify the difference between logical truth and practical truth. The drinker's paradox is especially valuable because it demonstrates how seemingly nonsensical statements can hold up under scrutiny. It teaches us to question our assumptions and approach problems with a more precise understanding of logic. Ultimately, the drinker's paradox is a reminder that logic doesn't always align with our expectations. It asks us to set aside common sense and focus on the structure of reasoning itself. By doing so, we gain a deeper appreciation for how logic works and why it sometimes leads us to surprising conclusions. Whether in a bar, a park, or a classroom, the paradox holds true, showing us that logic, even at its most counterintuitive, is a powerful tool for understanding the world. Imagine you are stranded on an island where every inhabitant belongs to one of two groups: truth-tellers or liars. The truth-tellers always tell the truth, while the liars always lie. On this island, you have a single task: figure out who belongs to which group. At first glance, this seems like it might be simple. Surely, you can just ask someone a question and deduce whether they are truthful or not. But as you start to think it through, the problem becomes more complex. If someone lies all the time, how do you know whether their answer is deceptive or not? What kind of questions could help you untangle the truth in such a scenario? The challenge begins when you realize that asking direct questions won't help. For example, if you ask someone, "Are you a truth teller?" both a truth teller and a liar would answer yes. A truth teller would truthfully say they tell the truth, while a liar, compelled to lie, would falsely claim to be a truth teller. You gain no useful information from this exchange. To solve this puzzle, you must think carefully about how to phrase your questions in a way that exploits the logic of the truth tellers and liars. A classic approach is to ask about what another person would say. Imagine there are two people on the island standing next to you. You could ask person A, "What would person B say if I asked them whether you are a truth teller?" This question creates a logical loop. A truth teller, when answering this question, will truthfully describe the liar's answer. A liar, on the other hand, will lie about what the truth teller would say. In either case, you can decode the truth by interpreting the response carefully. Here's how it works. If person A is a truth teller, they will truthfully state what person B, the liar, would say. Since person B always lies, they would claim that person A is a liar. Person A would then truthfully report, "Person B would say that I am a liar." If person A is a liar, they will lie about what person B, the truth teller, would say. In this case, person B would truthfully say that person A is a liar, but person A will lie about this and claim person B would say that I am a truth teller. By analyzing this response, you can determine who is who. A liar always manipulates the answer in a way that exposes their dishonesty if you follow the logic. This type of reasoning feels abstract, but it becomes clearer with practice. The key is to structure your questions so that the answer doesn't depend on whether the person is truthful or deceptive. Instead, the question forces them into a logical framework that reveals their nature. Questions like, "What would you say if I asked?" or "What would another person say about?" create layers of logic that uncover the truth. This island scenario is not just a fun puzzle, it illustrates how logic can be used to solve seemingly impossible problems. The truth tellers and liars problem has been studied for centuries, partly because it is simple to state but complex to solve. It is often used in philosophy and computer science to teach principles of logic, reasoning, and decision-making. It forces you to think beyond surface-level answers and consider the deeper structure of how information is conveyed. One of the most fascinating aspects of this puzzle is how it forces you to rely on indirect reasoning. Most of the time, we are accustomed to taking answers at face value or seeking direct information. On the island, however, direct questions fail because the truth and lies sound identical on the surface. This reflects a broader lesson about communication in the real world. People often frame statements in ways that can obscure their intentions. Learning to ask the right questions, questions that reveal more than they conceal, is a skill that applies far beyond the island. The problem also highlights the power of self-referential questions. By asking someone what another person would say, you create a scenario where both groups must indirectly expose themselves. This type of reasoning is closely related to the concept of metacognition, or thinking about thinking. It encourages you to step back and analyze how information flows and where the hidden truths lie. In some variations of the puzzle, the complexity increases. Imagine that there are not just truth tellers and liars, but also people who randomly alternate between truth and lies. Now, asking a single question may not be enough to determine someone's nature. You would need to ask a series of questions and look for consistency or patterns in their responses. This added layer of randomness mirrors real-world situations where people are not perfectly consistent in their behavior or statements. It teaches us to gather more evidence and analyze it over time, rather than relying on a single interaction. The beauty of the truth tellers and liars puzzle is its universality. While it appears simple on the surface, it challenges some of our most basic assumptions about communication, truth, and logic. It shows how even in situations where information is unreliable or contradictory, clear thinking and structured reasoning can cut through the confusion. It also emphasizes the importance of carefully framing your questions to get the answers you need. Imagine applying this principle to everyday life. While we don't often encounter people who always lie or always tell the truth, we do deal with incomplete, biased, or misleading information. Whether you're analyzing a news story, negotiating a deal, or resolving a conflict, the ability to structure your questions and think critically about the answers is invaluable. The truth tellers and liars puzzle serves as a reminder that how we ask questions can be just as important as the answers we receive. At its core, the puzzle is about clarity. It strips away unnecessary complexity and forces you to think logically. The rules are simple. One group always tells the truth, and the other always lies. Within those rules lies a world of complexity, nuance, and discovery. By navigating the puzzle, you learn not just how to solve a riddle, but how to approach problems with patience, curiosity, and a clear mind. The island of truth tellers and liars remains a timeless thought experiment. It challenges you to think beyond the obvious, to question your assumptions, and to look for answers in unexpected places. It's a reminder that even in a world full of contradictions, truth can be found, if you know how to ask the right questions. The Epimenides Paradox is a classic example of a self-referential statement that creates logical confusion. It originates from the statement made by Epimenides, a philosopher and poet from ancient Crete, who said, "All Cretans are liars." At first glance, this might seem straightforward, but when you think about it, a problem emerges. If Epimenides, a Cretan himself, is telling the truth, then his statement must be true. But if it's true, then all Cretans, including himself, are liars, which would make his statement false. This contradiction forms the heart of the paradox and has puzzled thinkers for centuries. The paradox works because it is self-referential. The statement refers to the speaker's own truthfulness, creating a loop that cannot logically resolve. If the statement is true, then it must be false, and if it is false, it cannot be true. This kind of logical problem is what makes the Epimenides Paradox so intriguing and enduring. It forces us to confront the limitations of language, logic, and truth in ways that challenge our usual ways of thinking. To understand this paradox more deeply, it's helpful to think about similar examples. Consider the statement, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false, because that is what the sentence claims. But if it's false, then it must actually be true, because a false statement about being false is in fact true. This type of loop, where a statement contradicts itself, is often called a liar paradox. It appears simple, but it creates a tangle that logic struggles to untie. The Epimenides paradox differs slightly from the standard liar paradox because it is tied to a group rather than just a single statement. By saying all Cretans are liars, Epimenides is making a broader claim about the nature of truthfulness within his own group. This adds another layer of complexity. If we assume that all Cretans really are liars, then Epimenides cannot be truthful. But if he is not truthful, his statement about all Cretans being liars is itself a lie, meaning not all Cretans are liars. This creates a cycle of logical inconsistencies. This paradox doesn't just exist as a philosophical curiosity. It has real implications for how we think about truth and self-reference. For example, in the world of mathematics and formal logic, self-referential systems often lead to contradictions. A famous example is Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any sufficiently complex system of mathematics, there will always be statements that cannot be proven true or false using the rules of the system itself. Gödel's work was inspired by paradoxes like the one posed by Epimenides, highlighting how these seemingly simple puzzles can have profound implications. Another way to explore the Epimenides paradox is by considering the role of assumptions. When we hear the statement, "all Cretans are liars," we assume that it operates under the usual rules of truth and falsehood. But what if those rules don't apply in the way we expect? For instance, perhaps Epimenides meant something less literal, such as Cretans often lie, or Cretans are not entirely trustworthy. In that case, the statement might not be a paradox at all. It could just be an exaggeration or generalization. This shows how much the paradox relies on interpretation. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of lying itself. To call someone a liar suggests that they regularly or habitually tell falsehoods. But does that mean everything they say is false? Not necessarily. A person who lies often can still tell the truth sometimes. If we apply this idea to the Epimenides paradox, we might say that Epimenides, as a Cretan, could be lying about all Cretans being liars. But if he is lying, then some Cretans must tell the truth, which means his statement could still be partly correct. This blurs the line between truth and falsehood even further. One way to resolve the paradox is to shift the focus from logical absolutes to practical reasoning. In real life, people don't always speak in absolute terms. Statements like "everyone lies" or "nobody is trustworthy" are often understood as hyperbole, not literal truth. If we interpret Epimenides' statement this way, the paradox disappears. It becomes less about a logical contradiction and more about the complexities of human behavior and language. The paradox also connects to broader philosophical questions about self-reference and self-awareness. When someone makes a statement about themselves or their own group, they are both the observer and the observed. This creates a unique challenge for logic, which typically operates on the assumption that the subject and object of a statement are separate. By blurring this distinction, self-referential statements like "all Cretans are liars" reveal the limitations of traditional logic and force us to think in new ways. In modern times, the Epimenides paradox has been explored in fields beyond philosophy. In computer science, for instance, self-referential loops can cause problems in programming. A simple example is a piece of code that says, "If true, repeat this command." Without a condition to break the loop, the program will run indefinitely, much like the logical loop created by the Epimenides paradox. This shows how self-reference, while fascinating, can create practical challenges in addition to theoretical ones. Despite its complexity, the Epimenides paradox offers valuable insights. It reminds us that language is not always as precise as we might like. Words can have multiple meanings, and context matters. It also shows that truth is not always black and white. A statement can be partly true, partly false, or even entirely dependent on how it is interpreted. By grappling with these ideas, we can develop a deeper understanding of how we communicate and think. Ultimately, the Epimenides paradox is a reminder that some questions don't have simple answers. It invites us to explore the boundaries of logic and to consider the ways in which our assumptions shape our understanding of the world. Whether we approach it as a philosophical puzzle, a linguistic curiosity, or a mathematical challenge, the paradox continues to inspire reflection and debate. It demonstrates that even the simplest statements can lead to profound and thought-provoking questions, challenging us to think beyond the limits of conventional reasoning. The two envelopes problem is a fascinating puzzle that challenges our understanding of probability, logic, and decision-making. It begins with a simple scenario. You are presented with two envelopes, each containing some money. One envelope has exactly twice as much money as the other. You don't know which is which. You choose one envelope, but before you open it, you are given the option to switch to the other. At this point, the question arises, should you switch, or should you stick with your original choice? At first glance, the problem seems straightforward. You might think there's no reason to switch. After all, without knowing which envelope contains more money, both envelopes seem equally likely to hold the larger amount. Switching would appear to be a 50-50 gamble with no advantage gained. But then, a deeper consideration leads to confusion. Let's break it down. Suppose you open your chosen envelope and find $100 inside. If this is the smaller amount, the other envelope must contain $200. However, if this is the larger amount, the other envelope must contain $50. In this case, there's a 50% chance the other envelope holds $200 and a 50% chance it holds $50. On average, switching would give you an expected value of $125 because $200.5 plus $50.5 equals $125. This expected value is higher than the $100 you already have, so it seems like switching is the better choice. But here's the paradox. This logic applies no matter what amount you find in the first envelope. No matter how much money you see, switching always appears to offer a higher expected value. If that's true, then you should always switch. But if the logic applies equally to both envelopes, you could endlessly switch back and forth without ever resolving which envelope is better. This contradiction lies at the heart of the two envelopes problem. To understand where this reasoning goes wrong, we need to dig deeper into the assumptions. The key issue lies in the way probabilities are assigned to the amounts in the envelopes. In the example above, we implicitly assume that each amount has an equal chance of being the smaller or larger amount. But this assumption is problematic. If one envelope contains $100, the other must contain either $50 or $200, depending on whether $100 is the smaller or larger amount. However, the problem doesn't specify how the amounts are distributed initially. Without knowing this, we can't calculate meaningful probabilities. Let's consider another perspective. Suppose the two envelopes were filled according to a specific rule. For example, one envelope contains a randomly chosen amount, and the other contains double that amount. If the amounts were chosen in this way, you would need to know the range of possible values before you could assign probabilities. Without that range, it's impossible to determine whether switching is advantageous. This highlights another key feature of the problem. The paradox arises because we are trying to reason about probabilities without sufficient information. Some philosophers and mathematicians argue that the paradox doesn't reflect a real flaw in decision-making, but rather exposes the limitations of how we think about uncertainty. In practice, if you're given two envelopes with no additional context, you truly have no way of knowing whether switching is better or worse. The 50% probabilities assigned to each outcome are based on incomplete reasoning. They don't account for how the money was allocated between the envelopes in the first place. Another way to resolve the paradox is by considering symmetry. Before you open either envelope, the two options are indistinguishable. There is no information favoring one envelope over the other. This symmetry suggests that there's no rational reason to switch once you've chosen an envelope. Even after you open the first envelope and see a specific amount of money, the problem doesn't provide any new information about whether switching is beneficial. You still don't know how the amounts were distributed, so the situation remains symmetrical in terms of your knowledge. To illustrate this point, imagine playing this game repeatedly with different pairs of envelopes. Over time, you would notice that switching doesn't consistently lead to better outcomes. Some of the time, switching would result in a gain, and other times it would result in a loss. On average, the outcomes would balance out. This reinforces the idea that the initial choice and the decision to switch are equally valid strategies in the absence of additional information. Despite these explanations, the two envelopes problem continues to intrigue people because it challenges intuitive thinking. The paradox tricks our brains into seeing a pattern that isn't really there. The idea of expected value makes it seem like switching is always better, even though the underlying logic doesn't hold up under scrutiny. This tension between intuition and rational analysis is what makes the problem so compelling. The two envelopes problem also raises broader questions about how we handle uncertainty in everyday life. Decision-making often involves incomplete information, and we must rely on assumptions to fill in the gaps. In some cases, these assumptions work well, but in others they lead to errors or paradoxes like this one. The problem reminds us to carefully examine the reasoning behind our choices and to be cautious about overinterpreting probabilities when the underlying assumptions are unclear. Ultimately, the two envelopes problem isn't just a mathematical puzzle. It's a thought experiment that challenges us to think critically about probability, symmetry, and decision-making. It highlights the importance of understanding the limits of our reasoning and the role of assumptions in shaping our conclusions. While the paradox may never have a definitive solution, it offers a valuable lesson in how to approach uncertainty with both logic and humility. The problem of the criterion is a classic philosophical puzzle about knowledge. It asks a deceptively simple question: how do we know what we know? To figure out what is true or reliable, we need a method to judge it. But how do we know that method is trustworthy without already knowing what truth looks like? The issue creates a loop where we cannot establish a reliable criterion for knowledge without first having knowledge itself. This circular problem lies at the heart of the debate over how humans understand and verify the world around them. To grasp the problem more clearly, imagine you are trying to determine whether a painting is authentic. You might consult an expert, but how do you know the expert is credible? Perhaps you could check their credentials or see if their previous evaluations have been accurate. But this requires trusting another standard, maybe the institution that granted their credentials or historical records of their evaluations. How do you verify those? At some point, you realize there's no ultimate, unshakable standard to confirm what is reliable without referring to another, possibly flawed standard. This is the essence of the problem of the criterion. This issue was first articulated by the Greek philosopher Sextus Empiricus, who questioned whether we could ever truly escape this loop. It's a cornerstone of skepticism. The problem begins with two basic questions: what do we know, and how do we decide what to believe? The first question focuses on the scope of our knowledge. The second asks for the standard or criterion by which we judge that knowledge. The problem arises because you can't answer one question without the other. To know what you can trust, you need a method for evaluating it. But to develop that method, you need to already know what's trustworthy. It's a catch-22. Take, for example, scientific reasoning. Most people trust science as a reliable way to learn about the world. Science is based on evidence, experimentation, and observation. But why do we trust evidence and observation? Someone might say that past scientific discoveries have proven accurate and led to practical advancements, so science must be reliable. However, this argument uses science's past successes as evidence for its reliability, which assumes the very method you're trying to validate. This circular reasoning doesn't solve the problem, it just shifts it. The same issue arises in other areas, like morality. Imagine you're trying to decide whether an action is right or wrong. You might appeal to a set of moral principles, like do no harm. But how do you know that principle is correct? Perhaps you argue it's self-evident, or that it aligns with human nature, or that it produces the best outcomes. But each of these claims requires another standard of judgment. How do you determine that outcomes matter, or that human nature is a valid guide? The chain of reasoning never truly ends. The problem of the criterion isn't just abstract philosophy. It affects real-world decisions. Consider a jury deciding a court case. They have to weigh evidence, testimony, and legal standards to reach a verdict. But how do they decide which evidence is credible? One witness might seem reliable, but how do they know? Maybe their demeanor or consistency makes them convincing, but these judgments rely on assumptions about how truth and reliability manifest. The jury must trust their instincts, previous experience, or expert guidance, none of which are infallible. This doesn't mean the jury can't reach a verdict, but it shows that their decision is built on layers of trust in criteria that can't be fully verified. A similar issue appears in news and media. People often ask, how do I know which sources to trust? Some might say to rely on reputable outlets, but how do we determine which outlets are reputable? Others might suggest cross-referencing information, but that assumes you know which sources to use for comparison. In an age of misinformation, this problem feels especially relevant. The question of how to judge the credibility of information has no easy answer, because it's tied to the larger problem of the criterion. One response to the problem is foundationalism. Foundationalists argue that some beliefs or standards are self-evident and don't require further justification. For example, "I think, therefore I am" is often seen as a foundational belief because it's impossible to doubt without affirming its truth. Foundationalism tries to break the circularity by grounding knowledge in these self-evident truths. However, critics argue that what seems self-evident to one person might not to another. What makes something truly foundational, and how do we agree on it? Another response is coherentism. Coherentists reject the idea of foundational beliefs. Instead, they argue that beliefs are justified by how well they fit into a larger, coherent system of knowledge. For example, scientific theories are accepted not because of any single piece of evidence, but because they fit together into a logical framework that explains a wide range of phenomena. However, coherentism doesn't escape the loop entirely. It relies on the idea that coherence itself is a valid standard, which still requires justification. Skepticism offers a different approach. Instead of trying to solve the problem, skeptics embrace it. They argue that humans can never achieve absolute certainty. Instead, we should acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and focus on practical, probabilistic reasoning. For example, while we can't prove beyond all doubt that science is reliable, its consistent success in producing results makes it reasonable to trust. Skepticism doesn't eliminate the problem of the criterion, but shifts the focus to what works in practice. The problem of the criterion also raises questions about how humans perceive the world. Our senses are the primary way we gather information, but how do we know they're accurate? If you see a red apple, you assume it's red. But your perception depends on your eyes and brain interpreting light. What if your eyes are faulty? You could check with someone else, but that assumes their perception is accurate. Once again, the chain of trust loops back on itself. Despite its complexity, the problem of the criterion doesn't mean humans are incapable of knowledge. Instead, it highlights the assumptions and frameworks we rely on. Acknowledging these limits can lead to greater intellectual humility. It reminds us that every belief, no matter how solid it seems, rests on a foundation of trust in something else. This doesn't make knowledge meaningless. It makes it dynamic and ever-evolving. In everyday life, we often act as if the problem doesn't exist. We make decisions, form beliefs, and trust certain criteria without overanalyzing them. This practical approach works because absolute certainty isn't necessary for most decisions. While philosophers wrestle with the problem of the criterion, most people navigate it unconsciously. We build knowledge based on experience, community standards, and shared assumptions, even if we can't prove those assumptions are infallible. The problem of the criterion challenges us to think deeply about the nature of knowledge and truth. It forces us to confront the limits of human understanding and the frameworks we take for granted. While it doesn't offer easy answers, it opens the door to richer, more thoughtful exploration of what it means to know. Whether in philosophy, science, or everyday life, this problem serves as a reminder that certainty is elusive, but curiosity is endless. The lottery coincidence is a thought experiment that forces us to question how we interpret improbable events. At its heart, it challenges our ability to distinguish between random chance and deliberate manipulation. Imagine you buy a lottery ticket, and against all odds, you win. The probability of this happening is so low that it feels like an extraordinary event. But now ask yourself, is it more likely that you legitimately won or that the lottery was rigged in your favor? This question might seem strange at first, but it reveals the tension between probability and our perceptions of chance. To break this down, let's start with the basics. In most lotteries, the odds of winning are astronomically low. For example, in a lottery with a 1 in a million chance of winning, there's a 0.001% probability that any single ticket is the winner. When you think about those odds, it seems almost impossible that you could win. Yet, someone inevitably does. Winning, despite the low odds, is an expected outcome when enough people participate. The key is understanding that improbability doesn't make an event impossible. Even the rarest events become likely when given enough opportunities to occur. Now let's flip the perspective. Imagine that you win, and someone accuses you of cheating. They claim the odds of you winning were so small that the only logical explanation is that the system was rigged. On the surface, this argument seems to make sense. The probability of winning is so low that it feels suspicious. But does that mean it's more likely that the lottery was manipulated? To answer this, you have to weigh two competing possibilities: the improbability of winning naturally versus the possibility of foul play. Here's where the thought experiment gets tricky. For the lottery to be rigged, someone would need the means, motive, and opportunity to manipulate the results. This introduces its own layer of complexity. If you examine the situation closely, you might realize that rigging a lottery, especially one heavily monitored by regulations, could be even less likely than winning it legitimately. The claim that the lottery was rigged needs evidence, but in its absence, the simpler explanation is that you just got lucky. This follows the principle of Occam's razor. When faced with competing explanations, the simplest one is usually correct. But let's push this further. Humans are wired to see patterns, even in randomness. This tendency, known as apophenia, makes us look for reasons behind events, especially improbable ones. When something unlikely happens, like winning a lottery, we instinctively search for meaning. We might think, why me? Was this fate? Or is there something I don't know? These questions arise because our brains struggle to accept randomness. We want events to have causes, and we're uncomfortable with the idea that some things just happen by chance. This discomfort becomes even more pronounced when the improbable event feels personal. If you win the lottery, it's not just a statistical anomaly, it's a life-changing moment. It's hard to see it as purely random because it directly affects you. This emotional reaction can make you question whether something deeper is at play. The lottery coincidence thought experiment highlights this bias, showing how our perceptions of probability are influenced by personal impact. Now, let's complicate the scenario further. Imagine you didn't just win the lottery, you won twice. The odds of this happening are astronomically low, yet it has occurred in real life. For instance, a woman in the United States won 2 major lottery jackpots within a few years. People were understandably skeptical. Statisticians pointed out that while the odds of winning twice are incredibly small, they're not zero. Given the millions of people who play the lottery, it's not impossible for such a rare event to occur somewhere. However, because the event is so unusual, it's easy to jump to conclusions about fraud or manipulation. This reaction reveals how we struggle to comprehend extreme improbability. The lottery coincidence also has broader implications for how we interpret events beyond lotteries. For example, think about coincidences in everyday life. You might run into an old friend in a city neither of you lives in, or you might dream about something that later happens. These events feel meaningful because they're unlikely, but are they truly significant, or are they just random occurrences that stand out because we notice them? The same logic applies to the lottery. Winning feels extraordinary, but it's only one possible outcome in a universe of possibilities. Another layer to this paradox is how we view systems of fairness. Lotteries are designed to be random, but their structure makes some outcomes inevitable. Someone has to win, even if the odds are low. This creates a tension between our expectations of fairness and the reality of chance. If a lottery winner is accused of cheating simply because their win was improbable, it undermines the entire premise of randomness. The thought experiment forces us to confront our biases about what we consider fair or suspicious. The lottery coincidence also raises questions about how we evaluate evidence. When we say something is unlikely, we're making a judgment based on probabilities. But probabilities are only part of the equation. Context matters too. If you know a lottery has strict safeguards, the odds of fraud might be lower than the odds of someone winning naturally. This context shapes how we interpret improbable events. It reminds us that probability alone doesn't determine what's true. We must also consider the circumstances. Ultimately, the lottery coincidence highlights the limits of human intuition when it comes to chance. We're not naturally good at understanding probability, and our emotions often cloud our judgment. The thought experiment challenges us to think critically about how we interpret unlikely events. It forces us to ask whether our suspicions are based on evidence or simply on our discomfort with randomness. The paradox doesn't have a definitive answer, which is what makes it so fascinating. It's not about proving whether the lottery was rigged or legitimate. It's about exploring how we think. It reveals the assumptions and biases that shape our understanding of the world. In doing so, it encourages us to question our perceptions and to approach improbability with both curiosity and skepticism. The lottery coincidence reminds us that life is full of rare events. Sometimes they're just luck. Other times, they may point to deeper patterns. The challenge is learning to tell the difference without letting our instincts lead us astray. Whether it's a lottery win, a chance encounter, or a strange coincidence, the improbable is a part of life. Understanding it helps us make sense of the world, even when the odds seem impossible. The Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome is a concept that captures what happens when power, once unleashed, spirals out of control. The term comes from a famous story, most notably depicted in Disney's Fantasia, where an apprentice enchants a broom to perform his chores. The broom follows the apprentice's command to fetch water, but when the task is done, it doesn't stop. It continues fetching water, flooding the room. The apprentice, lacking the skill to undo the spell, watches helplessly as the chaos grows worse. This tale has become a metaphor for situations where human actions or creations, especially those involving technology or systems, take on a life of their own. The idea resonates deeply because it illustrates a key human vulnerability: the gap between power and control. People often develop tools or systems to solve problems, but they don't always consider the long-term consequences. Once set in motion, these systems can act in unexpected ways, creating new problems that spiral out of control. This isn't just a fable, it's a recurring theme in history, technology, and even nature. Take the Industrial Revolution as an example. The invention of machinery and factories transformed societies, making production faster and cheaper. But this rapid progress came with unforeseen consequences. Pollution from factories poisoned rivers and air. Child labor became a widespread problem. The very tools designed to make life easier created a host of new challenges. The same pattern can be seen in modern technologies. The rise of artificial intelligence offers incredible potential, but it also raises ethical concerns. What happens when AI systems make decisions that humans can't understand or control? This echoes the apprentice's dilemma. Once you set the broom, or in this case, the algorithm, into motion, how do you stop it when it goes too far? This syndrome also appears in the natural world. Consider the introduction of non-native species to ecosystems. In Australia, rabbits were brought in during the 19th century for hunting. Without natural predators, their population exploded, causing widespread ecological damage. What seemed like a simple solution to a minor problem became an environmental crisis. The same principle applies to many human-made interventions in nature. Efforts to control pests with chemicals, for instance, have often backfired. Pesticides kill not only pests, but also beneficial insects like bees, disrupting entire ecosystems. Over time, pests can develop resistance, making the problem even harder to solve. The Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome also plays out in financial systems. During the 2008 global financial crisis, complex financial products like mortgage-backed securities were created to maximize profits. These tools became so complicated that even the experts using them didn't fully understand their risks. When the housing market collapsed, these financial instruments amplified the damage, causing a cascade of economic failures. The systems designed to grow wealth ended up threatening the entire global economy. The digital age has introduced new forms of this syndrome. Social media platforms, for example, were designed to connect people and share information. While they've succeeded in that goal, they've also created problems like misinformation, echo chambers, and mental health issues. Algorithms, optimized to keep users engaged, often prioritize sensational or polarizing content, unintentionally contributing to social divisions. The platforms can't simply turn off these effects without undermining their business models. Once again, the apprentice finds themselves unable to stop the enchanted broom. One of the most concerning modern examples is climate change. Human innovation, particularly during the industrial era, unlocked the ability to harness fossil fuels for energy. This allowed societies to grow at an unprecedented rate, improving living standards worldwide. However, burning these fuels has released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, trapping heat and disrupting the planet's climate systems. Rising temperatures, melting ice caps, and extreme weather events are just the beginning of a complex chain reaction. Even though we now understand the risks, the systems built around fossil fuels are so deeply entrenched that reversing the damage feels like an impossible task. The more we try to fix the problem, the more unintended consequences we uncover. A key element of the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome is the lack of foresight. The apprentice casts the spell without understanding its full implications. Much like humanity often acts without fully considering the long-term effects of its innovations. This isn't always due to ignorance or carelessness. Sometimes, the urgency to solve a problem overshadows the need to plan for potential consequences. Other times, people simply can't predict how a system will behave once it grows beyond their control. Another factor is the reliance on quick fixes. The apprentice doesn't want to carry water manually, so he takes a shortcut with magic. Similarly, humans often seek immediate solutions without addressing root causes. This is especially true in areas like healthcare, where antibiotics have revolutionized medicine. While they've saved countless lives, overuse has led to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, a serious global health threat. What began as a miracle solution is now creating new challenges that are harder to solve. The syndrome also reveals the importance of humility in the face of complexity. The apprentice assumes he can handle the broom, just as humans assume they can manage their creations. But complexity often outpaces understanding. In systems like global supply chains, environmental policies, or financial markets, small changes can have unpredictable ripple effects. This concept, known as the butterfly effect, shows how interconnected systems amplify seemingly minor actions. Recognizing these dynamics requires a shift in mindset. Instead of assuming mastery, people must approach complex systems with caution and respect. So how can the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome be avoided? The first step is to recognize its patterns. By studying past examples, humanity can learn to anticipate unintended consequences. The second step is to build safeguards into systems from the start. This might mean creating fail-safes, conducting rigorous testing, or planning for worst-case scenarios. The third step is adaptability. When problems arise, systems need to be flexible enough to adjust without collapsing. The final step is responsibility. Just as the sorcerer returns to fix the apprentice's mistake, those who create systems must take accountability for their impacts. While the Sorcerer's Apprentice syndrome highlights risks, it also underscores human creativity and resilience. The same ingenuity that creates problems can also solve them. Whether it's finding ways to mitigate climate change, designing ethical AI, or building more sustainable societies, the potential for positive change is immense. The challenge lies in balancing ambition with caution, ensuring that the brooms we set into motion serve us rather than overwhelm us. The infinite regress of reasons is a concept that challenges how we justify what we believe or know. At its core, it asks a simple but unsettling question. How do we explain why something is true without needing an endless chain of reasons? For every claim or belief we hold, we typically justify it by referring to something else. But what happens when we ask for the justification of that reason, and then the one after that? This cycle could, in theory, go on forever. That's where the problem lies. It's not just a philosophical puzzle, it has real implications for how we think about truth, knowledge, and reasoning. To understand the infinite regress of reasons, imagine a child repeatedly asking why. You might start with a simple statement, such as, "The sky is blue." The child asks, "Why is the sky blue?" You answer, "Because sunlight scatters through the atmosphere." Then comes another why. "Why does sunlight scatter?" And you reply, "Because of how light interacts with molecules in the air." But the questions don't stop there. Each answer leads to another why, and eventually, you might find yourself unable to explain further. You either say, "I don't know," or you settle on something like, "That's just the way it is." This simple example illustrates the problem of infinite regress. For every reason we provide, a further reason can always be demanded. If we insist on having a reason for everything, we risk falling into an endless loop. The infinite regress of reasons challenges us to think about where, if anywhere, this chain of justification should stop. Philosophers have explored this issue for centuries. The problem can be summarized as follows. When we justify a belief, we rely on another belief. That second belief then needs justification, which depends on a third belief, and so on. If we insist on providing a justification for every belief in the chain, we face an infinite regress. But infinite chains of reasoning are impractical and, some argue, impossible. So how do we resolve this? One approach is foundationalism. Foundationalists argue that the chain of reasons doesn't need to go on forever because it can stop at certain basic beliefs. These basic beliefs don't require further justification. They're considered self-evident or obvious. For example, foundationalists might point to sensory experiences, like seeing a tree or feeling pain, as beliefs that don't need external reasons. You see the tree, and that's enough to believe it exists. Foundationalism provides a way to stop the regress by grounding reasoning in something that doesn't require further explanation. Another approach is coherentism. Coherentists reject the idea of foundational beliefs. Instead, they argue that beliefs are justified by how well they fit into a broader web of interconnected beliefs. Think of a spider web. No single strand holds the entire web together, but the web as a whole is stable. In coherentism, no belief stands alone, but the network of beliefs supports each one. The regress of reason stops not because we find a foundational belief, but because the system as a whole provides justification. A third approach is infinitism, which embraces the infinite regress. Infinitists argue that the chain of reasons doesn't need to stop. Instead, they claim that an infinite series of reasons can provide justification, as long as each step in the chain adds something new. While this idea may seem counterintuitive, infinitists believe that the possibility of an infinite regress isn't a problem. It's just a feature of how reasoning works. Each of these approaches has its strengths and weaknesses. Foundationalism offers clarity, but raises questions about what counts as a basic belief. Coherentism avoids the need for foundational beliefs, but risks becoming circular, as beliefs justify each other within the same system. Infinitism sidesteps the need for a stopping point, but faces challenges in explaining how infinite chains of reasoning work in practice. The infinite regress of reasons doesn't just apply to abstract philosophy, it's relevant to everyday life. Consider how we justify moral beliefs. If you believe that helping others is good, you might justify it by saying it creates happiness. But why is happiness good? If you answer, because it improves well-being, someone could still ask, why is well-being valuable? The chain of reasoning can continue indefinitely, forcing you to either settle on a foundational belief, argue that your beliefs form a coherent system, or accept the possibility of infinite justification. Science also grapples with this problem. Scientific explanations rely on observations, theories, and evidence, but they're not immune to the regress of reasons. A scientist might explain a phenomenon using a particular theory, but that theory itself relies on prior assumptions and evidence. Dig deep enough, and you'll reach questions about the nature of reality or the limits of human knowledge. At some point, even science encounters the challenge of justifying its most basic principles. The infinite regress of reasons also plays a role in debates about skepticism. Skeptics often use the regress problem to question whether we can truly know anything at all. If every belief requires justification, and justification leads to an endless chain, how can we claim to know anything with certainty? Skepticism forces us to confront the limits of our reasoning and consider whether some things must simply be accepted without further explanation. Despite its complexity, the infinite regress of reasons invites us to think critically about how we justify our beliefs. It reminds us that our understanding of the world isn't as straightforward as it seems. Whether we embrace foundational beliefs, coherent systems, or infinite chains of reasoning, the regress problem challenges us to examine the foundations of our thinking. Ultimately, the infinite regress of reasons is a paradox without a simple solution. It's not something to be solved in the traditional sense, but rather a lens through which to explore how we think and justify what we believe. By confronting the infinite regress, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity of reasoning and the limits of human knowledge. It's a reminder that some questions may not have final answers, and that's part of what makes them worth asking. The Euthyphro Dilemma is one of the most well-known philosophical puzzles, named after a dialogue by Plato. In this conversation, Socrates asks a seemingly simple question: is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? At first glance, it seems like a straightforward query, but it reveals deep and challenging questions about morality, divinity, and the nature of goodness. To understand the dilemma, it helps to break it down. The first option is that something is good because the gods command it. This means that moral values are determined solely by divine will. Whatever the gods decide is good becomes good, and whatever they reject is bad. On the surface, this makes morality clear and objective. If the gods set the rules, then all one has to do is follow them. However, this raises a troubling issue. If goodness is simply what the gods command, then it seems arbitrary. If the gods decided that lying or stealing were good, then those acts would become morally right, even though they seem wrong to us. This would make morality dependent on divine whim, with no deeper reason behind it. The second option is that the gods command something because it is good. In this case, morality exists independently of the gods. The gods recognize what is good and choose to endorse it. This seems more intuitive because it suggests that moral values are rooted in something stable and universal, not just in the will of the gods. However, this raises another problem. If goodness exists independently of the gods, then the gods are not the ultimate source of morality. They are simply messengers or enforcers of a higher moral truth. This seems to diminish the power and authority of the gods, as they are no longer the creators of right and wrong, but are subject to an external standard. The dilemma leaves us in a bind. If morality comes solely from divine command, it feels arbitrary and potentially unjust. If morality exists independently of divine command, then the gods are not truly sovereign over morality. Either way, the relationship between morality and divinity becomes deeply complicated. To see how this dilemma plays out in practice, consider its implications for different belief systems. In monotheistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, God is often viewed as the ultimate source of morality. The Euthyphro Dilemma challenges this view by asking whether God's commands create morality or reflect it. If morality depends entirely on God's commands, then it seems arbitrary. For example, the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," is good only because God said so. But if God had commanded something different, such as "Thou shalt kill," would that also be good? This makes moral laws seem less like timeless truths and more like rules that could change on a whim. On the other hand, if God commands something because it is already good, then morality does not originate with God. It exists independently, which undermines the idea that God is the ultimate foundation of morality. Philosophers and theologians have wrestled with this dilemma for centuries. One response is to argue that morality is grounded in God's nature rather than in God's commands. In this view, God does not decide what is good arbitrarily. Instead, goodness is an essential part of who God is. For example, if God is inherently loving and just, then God's commands reflect those qualities. Lying and stealing are wrong, not because God randomly decided they were wrong, but because they contradict God's loving and just nature. This response avoids the problem of arbitrariness while maintaining that morality ultimately depends on God. However, it still raises questions. If goodness is part of God's nature, then is God's nature itself subject to some higher standard of goodness? If so, we are back to the idea of morality existing independently of God. The Euthyphro Dilemma also has implications beyond religion. Even in secular contexts, it raises important questions about the nature of morality. If moral values do not come from a divine source, then where do they come from? Are they universal truths that exist independently of human opinion, or are they social constructs created by cultures and societies? For example, many people agree that acts like murder and theft are wrong. But are they wrong because of some objective moral standard, or because humans have collectively decided they are harmful and undesirable? The dilemma forces us to think about the origins and foundations of our moral beliefs, whether we attribute them to a divine source or not. One way to approach the dilemma is to reframe the question. Instead of asking whether morality depends on divine command or exists independently, we might ask what makes something good in the first place. For example, some philosophers argue that morality is based on the consequences of actions. In this view, an action is good if it leads to positive outcomes, such as happiness, well-being, or the reduction of suffering. This approach, known as consequentialism, does not rely on divine authority or external standards. Instead, it focuses on practical results. However, consequentialism has its own challenges. Determining what counts as a positive outcome can be subjective, and different people may disagree about what consequences are most important. Other philosophers argue that morality is based on duties or principles rather than outcomes. This view, known as deontology, suggests that certain actions are right or wrong regardless of their consequences. For example, lying might always be wrong because it violates a fundamental principle of honesty. Deontology avoids the subjectivity of consequentialism, but can lead to rigid rules that seem impractical or overly strict. For instance, if lying is always wrong, does that mean it is wrong to lie to protect someone's life? These debates show that even outside the context of divine command, the nature of morality remains complex and contested. The Euthyphro Dilemma ultimately challenges us to think deeply about the relationship between morality, authority, and reason. It asks us to consider whether moral truths are created or discovered, whether they are fixed or flexible, and whether they depend on divine will or human understanding. While the dilemma does not provide easy answers, it serves as a powerful tool for exploring these questions. By grappling with it, we gain a better understanding of the complexities of morality and the challenges of defining what it means to be good. Whether we look to religion, philosophy, or practical reasoning for guidance, the Euthyphro Dilemma reminds us that morality is not a simple matter, but a profound and ongoing journey of discovery. The paradox of omniscience is a fascinating and challenging concept to explore. At its core, the paradox questions whether it is logically possible for a being to know everything, including its own future actions. If an omniscient being truly knows everything, this would include all events in the universe, every decision made by every creature, and even every thought or action the being itself will take. However, this idea raises difficult questions. Can such a being act freely if it already knows everything it will do? Does its foreknowledge limit its power or freedom to choose? These questions lie at the heart of the paradox. To understand this paradox, let's consider what omniscience means. An omniscient being, by definition, knows everything there is to know, past, present, and future. This includes not just facts about the external world, but also knowledge of its own thoughts, plans, and decisions. For example, if such a being decides to lift a stone tomorrow, it would already know that decision today. But if the being already knows this, is it truly free to decide otherwise? If it can change its mind, then its previous knowledge of lifting the stone would have been incorrect, which contradicts the idea of omniscience. On the other hand, if the being cannot change its mind, then it seems limited by its own foreknowledge, raising the question of whether it is truly all-powerful or free. To illustrate this further, imagine a scenario involving a hypothetical omniscient being. Suppose this being writes a detailed book describing every event in the universe, including every action it will take. The book is perfectly accurate. It cannot be wrong, as this would contradict the being's omniscience. However, once the book is written, could the being choose to act differently from what the book predicts? If it does, the book would be incorrect. If it cannot, then it seems trapped by its own knowledge. This is where the paradox becomes evident. Omniscience appears to conflict with free will. Some philosophers argue that the paradox arises from a misunderstanding of what it means to know the future. They suggest that foreknowledge does not necessarily mean determinism. For instance, just because a being knows what will happen does not mean it caused those events, or that the events couldn't happen differently. Consider a simple analogy. If you record a football game and later watch the recording, you know how the game ends, but your knowledge doesn't affect the player's actions during the game. In this view, an omniscient being's knowledge of future events doesn't necessarily prevent those events from being freely chosen. However, this explanation doesn't fully resolve the paradox when applied to the being itself. If the omniscient being knows in advance what it will do, can it act differently from what it knows? If it can, its previous knowledge was wrong. If it cannot, then it seems bound by its own foreknowledge, which challenges the idea of freedom. This dilemma highlights the tension between knowing everything and having the ability to act freely. Another layer of complexity arises when considering whether an omniscient being can know the unknowable. For example, can it know the outcome of truly random events like the decay of a radioactive atom? Quantum mechanics suggests that certain processes in the universe are fundamentally indeterminate, meaning their outcomes cannot be predicted with absolute certainty. If an omniscient being knows the outcomes of these processes, it raises questions about whether the universe is truly random. If the being does not know these outcomes, then it seems its knowledge is incomplete, which contradicts the definition of omniscience. The paradox also touches on the concept of self-knowledge. For an omniscient being to truly know everything, it must also know every detail about itself, its thoughts, motivations, and actions. But can a being fully comprehend itself without creating a loop of infinite reflection? Imagine standing between two mirrors, each reflecting the other endlessly. The reflections stretch on forever, creating a complex and infinite image. Similarly, an omniscient being's attempt to fully know itself might lead to an infinite loop of self-reflection. This raises the question of whether complete self-knowledge is even possible, even for an omniscient being. Some theologians and philosophers attempt to resolve the paradox by redefining omniscience. They argue that omniscience does not necessarily include knowledge of future free actions. In this view, the future is not yet fixed, and even an omniscient being cannot know what hasn't been decided. Instead, the being knows all possible outcomes and is aware of every choice that could be made, but it doesn't know which choice will occur until it happens. This idea preserves free will while maintaining a broad definition of knowledge, though it limits omniscience in a specific way. Others argue that the paradox only exists because human logic is limited. From this perspective, the idea of omniscience is a concept beyond human understanding, and any attempts to analyze it using logic will inevitably fall short. This view suggests that the paradox isn't a true contradiction, but rather a reflection of the limitations of human reasoning. While this explanation avoids the problem, it leaves the paradox unresolved, offering no definitive answers. The paradox of omniscience also invites deeper questions about the nature of time and reality. If time is not linear, but instead a block where past, present, and future coexist, then an omniscient being's knowledge of the future may not conflict with free will. In this view, the future already exists, and the being's knowledge is simply an observation of events that are fixed in the fabric of time. However, this idea challenges our everyday understanding of time as something that flows, creating further philosophical puzzles. Ultimately, the paradox of omniscience reveals the complexity of reconciling infinite knowledge with freedom and action. It challenges our assumptions about logic, causality, and the nature of reality. While there may never be a definitive resolution, exploring the paradox deepens our understanding of the limits of knowledge and the mysteries of existence. Whether viewed through the lens of philosophy, theology, or science, the paradox continues to provoke thought and spark debate, reminding us of the intricate interplay between what we know and what we cannot comprehend. Quantum suicide is a thought experiment that combines the principles of quantum mechanics with the nature of reality and observation. It is a deeply unsettling concept that pushes the boundaries of how we think about life, death, and the universe itself. The idea starts with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that every possible outcome of a quantum event happens in its own separate universe. In simple terms, every decision or event that could go one way or another creates a branching of realities, each one existing as its own timeline. To understand quantum suicide, it's important to grasp how this interpretation connects with the act of observation. In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in multiple states at once, a concept known as superposition. However, the moment an observer measures or interacts with the particle, it chooses a definite state. This interaction between observation and reality is central to understanding how quantum mechanics works. The quantum suicide thought experiment takes this principle to a much darker place. Imagine a scenario where a person sets up an experiment similar to Schrödinger's cat, but instead of a cat in the box, the person performing the experiment is directly involved. The setup involves a machine that is connected to a quantum event, such as the spin of a particle. If the particle spins one way, the machine triggers a lethal event. If it spins the other way, nothing happens, and the person survives. The many worlds interpretation comes into play because every time the particle's spin is measured, the universe splits into two, one where the person dies and one where they live. From an outside perspective, this experiment seems straightforward. The person either survives or doesn't, and the probabilities play out as they would in any random event. However, from the perspective of the individual inside the experiment, things become far more bizarre. In the universes where the person dies, their consciousness ceases to exist. They can only ever experience the universes in which they survive. If the experiment is repeated enough times, the many worlds interpretation suggests that the person will always find themselves in the universe where they survive. To the individual, it might seem as though they are invincible, constantly jumping to the branches of reality where they continue to live. This leads to the concept of quantum immortality. The theory implies that an individual's consciousness can only exist in realities where they are alive. While death occurs in countless other universes, the person will only experience the branches where they remain alive, no matter how unlikely survival becomes. To an observer outside the experiment, the probabilities of survival diminish with each trial, and the eventual outcome is certain death. But to the person performing the experiment, their experience is one of continual survival, as though they are immune to the event's deadly consequences. The implications of this thought experiment are unsettling and difficult to accept. It challenges how we think about life and death, suggesting that individual consciousness is tied to specific branches of reality. If quantum immortality were true, it would mean that from the perspective of each individual, death is never experienced. Instead, their consciousness would always shift to a reality where they continue to exist. This doesn't mean that a person is physically immortal. Countless versions of them still die in other universes. It simply means that the experience of death is avoided by jumping between realities. This idea is troubling for several reasons. First, it raises questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. If your consciousness shifts to a new branch of reality every time you face death, are you still the same person? How do these branching realities affect the continuity of who you are? Second, it suggests that death, at least from the perspective of the individual, may not be as final as we currently believe. The concept of quantum immortality challenges our understanding of mortality and forces us to consider whether our perception of life is tied to a much larger, more complex system. Quantum suicide and quantum immortality are not scientific experiments. They are theoretical ideas meant to explore the implications of quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation. No one can or should attempt to test these concepts. The thought experiment is a way of grappling with the strange and often counterintuitive nature of quantum physics. It helps illustrate the potential consequences of a theory where every possible outcome creates a new universe. The idea also highlights the limitations of human understanding. Quantum mechanics operates on principles that often defy common sense. Concepts like superposition, entanglement, and wave-particle duality challenge our everyday experiences of how the world works. Quantum suicide takes these ideas to an extreme, forcing us to confront what it means to exist in a universe governed by such rules. It blurs the line between science, philosophy, and metaphysics, creating a space where our understanding of reality feels incomplete. Critics of the thought experiment argue that it misinterprets quantum mechanics and stretches the many worlds interpretation beyond its intended scope. The concept of quantum immortality assumes that consciousness plays a special role in selecting branches of reality. This idea is not supported by scientific evidence and remains purely speculative. Additionally, the thought experiment raises ethical and philosophical concerns. It uses the concept of death in a way that feels abstract, ignoring the profound emotional and physical realities of mortality. Despite these criticisms, quantum suicide remains a fascinating and provocative idea. It forces us to think about the implications of quantum mechanics in new and unsettling ways. It also reminds us that our understanding of the universe is still evolving. The many worlds interpretation is just one way to explain quantum phenomena, and it may not be the correct one. Other interpretations, such as the Copenhagen interpretation or pilot wave theory, offer different perspectives on how reality works. In the end, quantum suicide is less about proving a point and more about asking questions. It challenges us to think about the nature of reality, the role of observation, and the limits of human understanding. While it remains a thought experiment, it serves as a reminder of the complexity and mystery of the universe. Whether or not the many worlds interpretation is correct, the idea of quantum suicide shows how deeply quantum mechanics can shape our understanding of life, death, and everything in between. The problem of induction is one of the most important challenges in philosophy, yet it's something we rarely think about in daily life. Induction is how we make generalizations based on past experiences. It's the process of observing patterns and using them to predict the future. For example, the sun has risen every day in your life, so you assume it will rise again tomorrow. This seems logical and works well for most practical purposes. However, the problem of induction asks a deeper question. How can we be certain that the future will resemble the past? Is it rational to believe that patterns we've seen before will always continue? This issue was famously explored by the philosopher David Hume. He pointed out that our reliance on induction isn't based on reason, but on habit. When we see something happen repeatedly, like the sun rising or gravity pulling objects to the ground, we grow accustomed to expecting it. But that expectation isn't guaranteed. The sun rising every day is not proof that it will rise tomorrow. It's just what has happened so far. Hume's point is simple but unsettling. There's no logical way to prove that the future will follow the same rules as the past. Consider a simple example. You see a rooster crow every morning before sunrise. You conclude that the rooster causes the sun to rise. Of course, this is absurd. The rooster's behavior has nothing to do with the sun. But this illustrates the risk of relying on patterns without understanding the underlying cause. We assume that patterns reveal truths about the world, but sometimes they mislead us. This is why the problem of induction is so important. It forces us to question how much we can trust our assumptions. Another example is the story of the turkey. Imagine a turkey is fed every day by a farmer. Day after day, it observes the pattern. The farmer feeds it. Over time, the turkey grows confident that this will always happen. But the day before Thanksgiving, the pattern changes, and the turkey is no longer fed. It's slaughtered. From the turkey's perspective, induction failed. Its past experiences did not predict its future. This example highlights how relying on patterns can lead to incorrect conclusions when circumstances change. The problem of induction isn't just theoretical. It has practical implications for how we understand science, probability, and decision-making. Science, for example, relies heavily on induction. When scientists observe a phenomenon repeatedly, they formulate laws and theories based on those observations. But these laws are never proven with absolute certainty. They are always based on the assumption that the future will behave like the past. Newton's laws of motion, once considered universal, were later revised by Einstein's theory of relativity. This shows that even well-established scientific principles can change as we gain new information. The same uncertainty applies to probability. When you flip a coin, you expect that the chances of heads or tails are equal. This expectation is based on past experience with coin flips. But what if the coin is biased? Without knowing all the variables, we rely on patterns, and those patterns can sometimes be deceptive. The stock market is another example. Investors often try to predict future trends based on historical data. Yet markets are influenced by countless factors, many of which are unpredictable. Just because a stock performed well last year doesn't mean it will perform well this year. The problem of induction also challenges the idea of absolute knowledge. If we can't be certain that patterns will hold, how can we claim to truly know anything about the future? This question has led philosophers to consider alternatives. One approach is falsifiability, proposed by Karl Popper. Instead of trying to prove that a pattern is true, Popper argued that science should focus on disproving false claims. For example, rather than saying all swans are white, we should test the claim by searching for non-white swans. If we find even one black swan, the claim is false. This approach shifts the focus from proving patterns to challenging them, which avoids some of the pitfalls of induction. Another response to the problem of induction is pragmatism. Pragmatists argue that while induction isn't perfect, it works well enough for most purposes. The fact that it's unreliable in some cases doesn't mean we should abandon it altogether. After all, without induction, we wouldn't be able to function in the world. We rely on it every day, whether we're predicting the weather, planning our schedules, or making decisions. The problem of induction reminds us to be cautious, but doesn't mean we should stop using patterns to guide our actions. To understand the full scope of this issue, it's helpful to consider alternative ways of reasoning. Deduction, for example, is another form of logic. Deduction starts with a general principle and applies it to specific cases. For instance, if all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates must be mortal. Deduction is certain as long as the premises are true, but it has limitations. It doesn't help us discover new information. It only confirms what we already know. Induction, on the other hand, allows us to learn from experience, even if it comes with uncertainty. The tension between induction and deduction reveals the complexity of human reasoning. We rely on patterns to navigate the world, but we must also recognize their limitations. The problem of induction doesn't have a simple solution, but it forces us to think critically about how we form beliefs and make decisions. It reminds us that certainty is rare and that we should approach knowledge with humility. In daily life, the problem of induction can teach us to be open-minded. Just because something has always been one way doesn't mean it will stay that way. Circumstances change, and surprises happen. By questioning our assumptions, we become better prepared to adapt when the unexpected occurs. This mindset is especially valuable in a world that is constantly changing. The problem of induction isn't just a challenge for philosophers, it's a reminder for all of us to think carefully, question deeply, and remain curious. Parfit's teleporter is a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of personal identity. It asks a simple yet unsettling question. If you use a teleporter to travel from one place to another, are you still the same person when you arrive? At first glance, it might seem obvious that you would be the same. After all, teleportation is just a form of transportation, like a car or a plane. But the way the teleporter works in this thought experiment introduces a deeper problem, one that forces us to reconsider what it means to be you. Imagine you step into a teleporter. The machine scans your body, mapping every molecule and atom in exact detail. It records everything, the way your cells are arranged, your brain's connections, your memories, your personality. Then, it destroys your physical body at the starting point and sends all the recorded information to a destination. At the destination, another machine uses this information to rebuild your body exactly as it was. The person who steps out of the teleporter looks, thinks, and acts just like you. They remember everything you did, know everyone you know, and feel like the same person who stepped into the teleporter. But is it really you? The problem lies in the destruction of your original body. If your physical body is annihilated and a new body is created elsewhere, is the new body still you, or is it just a perfect copy? Philosophers like Derek Parfit argue that this raises questions about what it means to be the same person over time. Is your identity tied to your physical body, or is it something more abstract, like your memories and personality? If the copy at the destination is identical in every way, does it even matter if the original was destroyed? Some people argue that the person who steps out of the teleporter is you. They point out that every cell in your body is already replaced over time. The you that existed 10 years ago no longer physically exists, but you still feel like the same person because your memories and consciousness have remained continuous. In this view, the teleporter simply speeds up a process that is already happening slowly. The copy at the destination is still you because it continues the same pattern of memories, thoughts, and experiences. Others disagree. They argue that destroying the original body breaks the chain of continuity. The person who steps out of the teleporter might believe they are you, but they are not the same person who stepped into the machine. Instead, they are a copy, a new person who starts their life at the moment they step out. The original you has been destroyed. In this view, teleportation is less like transportation and more like death followed by cloning. To make the problem even more complex, imagine the teleporter malfunctions. Instead of destroying your original body, it creates a copy at the destination while leaving the original intact. Now there are two of you, one at the starting point and one at the destination. Both have the same memories and believe they are the real you. Which one is the true version of you? If your identity is tied to your physical body, perhaps the original is the real you. But if your identity is based on your memories and personality, then both versions are equally you, even though they are now two separate individuals. This scenario highlights the tension between two ideas about personal identity. One idea, called the body view, says that your identity is tied to your physical body. The other, called the psychological view, says that your identity depends on the continuity of your memories, thoughts, and consciousness. Parfit's teleporter challenges both views by creating situations where the usual markers of identity, your body and your mind, no longer align in the way we expect. If we accept that the teleporter creates a perfect copy, we are forced to confront some uncomfortable implications. If the copy is truly you, then what does it mean to say that you exist? Does your sense of self rely on something deeper than physical or psychological continuity, something that cannot be copied? Or is the idea of a fixed, unchanging self an illusion? Parfit's experiment suggests that identity might not be as concrete as we like to believe. Instead, it might be a matter of perspective, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of our experiences. Some philosophers use this thought experiment to argue that personal identity is not what matters. They suggest that what really matters is the continuation of your experiences and memories, even if the physical or psychological continuity is interrupted. If the person who steps out of the teleporter feels like you, remembers your life, and behaves as you would, then for all practical purposes, they are you. From this perspective, the destruction of the original body is not a significant problem because the essence of you continues in the copy. Others are less comfortable with this conclusion. They point out that the teleporter raises ethical questions. If the original body is destroyed, is that equivalent to murder? Even if the person who steps out feels like you, does the destruction of the original violate your rights? And if both the original and the copy exist simultaneously, do they both have equal claims to your identity? These questions show how Parfit's teleporter blurs the boundaries of identity, forcing us to think about what it really means to be a person. Parfit's teleporter also has implications for technology and the future. If teleportation became a reality, how would society respond? Would people use teleporters without hesitation, trusting that their identity remains intact? Or would the destruction of the original body create a sense of unease, making teleportation a controversial technology? The thought experiment also raises questions about cloning, brain uploading, and artificial intelligence. If a copy of your brain could be uploaded to a computer, would that copy still be you? These ideas might seem futuristic, but they challenge us to think about the limits of identity and consciousness. In the end, Parfit's teleporter is not about finding a definitive answer. It's about exploring the complexities of personal identity and the assumptions we make about ourselves. It invites us to question whether our sense of self is tied to something physical, psychological, or something else entirely. The experiment forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about continuity, consciousness, and what it means to exist. While there may never be a clear resolution, the thought experiment reminds us that identity is not as simple as it seems. It challenges us to look beyond the surface and think deeply about who we are. The paradox of the burden of proof is a problem rooted in the idea of responsibility during debates or discussions. When someone makes a claim, they are typically expected to provide evidence to support it. However, things get tricky when the person who hears the claim challenges it by asking for more and more proof. This can create a situation where no amount of evidence is ever enough. The original claimant might feel trapped in an endless loop of justifying their position, while the other person continually shifts the goalposts. It's this dynamic that creates a paradox. If proving something requires constantly meeting impossible standards of evidence, can anything ever really be proven? To understand this paradox, consider a simple example. Imagine a friend tells you that they saw a UFO last night. This is a bold claim, so you ask them for evidence. They show you a blurry photo of a strange light in the sky. You respond by saying the photo could easily be something else, like a drone or an airplane. Your friend insists it was a UFO, but offers no further proof. You tell them that without more solid evidence, like a physical object or multiple credible witnesses, you can't believe their story. Here the question becomes, how much proof is enough? Is it fair to dismiss their claim entirely because they can't meet your standards? Or is there a point where their evidence, however limited, should at least be taken seriously? This issue frequently arises in scientific, philosophical, and even everyday discussions. In science, the burden of proof typically falls on those proposing a new theory. This makes sense because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone claims they've discovered a new particle, for example, they need to present experimental data that can be verified. Yet, even in science, there's a threshold where skepticism can become unreasonable. If every piece of evidence is dismissed as insufficient, then no amount of proof could ever convince a determined skeptic. This where the paradox emerges. While it's important to ask for evidence, it's also possible to use that demand as a way to avoid engaging with the claim altogether. Philosophy often explores this paradox through debates about existence. For example, if someone claims that God exists, they are often asked to provide proof. But if the person asking for proof dismisses every argument with, "That's not good enough," then the discussion becomes unproductive. The same happens when someone claims that God doesn't exist. A believer can demand proof of that claim too, and the same cycle begins. Neither side can fully prove their position, yet both feel the other has failed to meet the burden of proof. This creates a stalemate, where the debate isn't about finding truth, but about who can demand more evidence from the other side. This paradox becomes even clearer when we consider negative claims. If someone says, "There are no unicorns," how could they prove it? It's impossible to search the entire universe to confirm the non-existence of something. The person making the positive claim, "Unicorns exist," has the easier job. All they need is one piece of solid evidence, a real unicorn. This is why, in debates, the burden of proof typically falls on those making positive claims. However, those making negative claims aren't entirely off the hook. If they assert something strongly, they still need to justify why they believe it to be true, even if they can't offer absolute proof. The paradox of the burden of proof is also prevalent in modern social and political discussions. For example, imagine a heated debate about climate change. One side argues that human activities are causing global warming, citing studies and data. The opposing side dismisses these studies as biased or incomplete and demands more proof. No matter how much evidence is presented, they continue to question its validity, effectively avoiding the need to present any counter-evidence of their own. This creates a frustrating dynamic where the burden of proof feels like a one-way street, with one side constantly defending their claim while the other side steps any responsibility to prove their counter-arguments. In legal systems, the burden of proof plays a crucial role. In criminal cases, the prosecution must prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This protects individuals from being unjustly convicted based on weak or circumstantial evidence. However, this standard can sometimes lead to the paradoxical situation where obvious guilt cannot be legally proven. If a murderer leaves behind strong but circumstantial evidence, and the defense creates just enough doubt, the prosecution may fail to meet its burden of proof. While this protects innocent people, it also means that some guilty individuals go free. This demonstrates how the burden of proof, while necessary, can sometimes work against justice. The paradox of the burden of proof often arises in online debates, where people can make claims without much accountability. For instance, someone might say vaccines are harmful without offering any credible evidence. When challenged, they might insist that others disprove their claim rather than supporting it themselves. This is a classic example of shifting the burden of proof. The person making the claim avoids responsibility by turning the challenge onto their critics. This tactic can derail discussions and leave important topics unresolved. To navigate this paradox, it's important to approach claims with both skepticism and fairness. Skepticism ensures that we don't accept unsupported ideas, while fairness ensures that we don't demand impossible levels of proof. A reasonable approach is to ask for evidence that matches the strength of the claim. For example, extraordinary claims, like the existence of UFOs or telepathy, should be backed by extraordinary evidence. On the other hand, everyday claims, like it rained yesterday, don't require the same level of scrutiny. By calibrating our expectations, we can avoid falling into the trap of endless doubt. The paradox also teaches us to be mindful of our own biases. Sometimes we dismiss evidence not because it's insufficient, but because it challenges our beliefs. In such cases, demanding more proof becomes a way to protect our worldview rather than seeking truth. By recognizing this tendency, we can engage in discussions more openly and productively. It's also helpful to clarify the burden of proof at the start of any debate. Agreeing on who needs to provide evidence and what kind of evidence is acceptable can prevent misunderstandings and keep the discussion focused. Ultimately, the paradox of the burden of proof reminds us that knowledge is a shared responsibility. It's not enough to demand proof from others. We must also be willing to evaluate evidence honestly and provide justification for our own beliefs. While it's unlikely that every claim can be resolved to everyone's satisfaction, approaching the burden of proof with balance and integrity allows us to engage more thoughtfully with the world and with one another. Imagine a pill that could erase your bad memories. It wouldn't harm you physically, and it wouldn't alter your ability to function in day-to-day life. It would simply remove the memories of your most painful experiences, leaving you with a clean slate. You could let go of the moments that haunt you, the loss of a loved one, a betrayal, or a deep personal failure. But here's the question. Would taking that pill make you happier, or would it take away something essential to who you are? At first glance, the idea seems appealing. Painful memories can weigh us down, replaying in our minds and making us relive moments we'd rather forget. For someone struggling with the aftermath of a traumatic event, the pill might feel like a miracle. Imagine a person haunted by the memory of a serious car accident. They might find it hard to drive again, or even to sit in a car. The pill could take away the memory of the crash entirely, freeing them from the anxiety and fear that comes with it. Life could feel easier, simpler, and lighter. But then another question arises. If you erase the bad memories, what happens to the lessons you learned from them? Every painful experience teaches us something, even if the lesson isn't immediately clear. That same person who survived a car accident might have developed a deeper appreciation for life or a stronger sense of resilience. If they took the pill, they might lose the pain, but they could also lose the growth that came with it. Pain, for all its difficulty, shapes us. It forces us to adapt, to reflect, and to find meaning in our struggles. There's also the question of identity. Who are you without your memories? Our experiences, both good and bad, make up the story of our lives. They influence our decisions, our relationships, and even how we see ourselves. If you erase the difficult parts of that story, do you become someone new? Imagine a person who has spent years overcoming a tough breakup. That experience might have taught them what they value in a partner and what they want in a relationship. If they take the pill, they might forget the pain of the breakup, but they might also forget the clarity it brought. Would they lose part of themselves in the process? Another consideration is the long-term impact of erasing bad memories. If you forget the pain, does that mean you're more likely to make the same mistakes? Someone who erases the memory of a failed business venture might lose the lessons they learned about managing risk or making smarter decisions. Without those lessons, they might find themselves in similar situations, repeating patterns they no longer remember. Painful memories often serve as warnings, guiding us away from harmful choices. If those warnings disappear, do we lose the ability to grow and change? At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that some memories are so painful they seem unbearable. Trauma can leave deep scars that don't easily heal. For people who experience post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, certain memories can disrupt their lives entirely. Nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety can make even ordinary tasks feel impossible. In cases like these, the pill might feel like the only way to regain a sense of normalcy. It raises the question of whether the value of keeping painful memories always outweighs the harm they cause. Let's consider a different angle. What if someone only erased a single bad memory, but kept the rest of their experiences intact? For example, imagine someone who regrets a single decision that led to the loss of a friendship. They feel guilt and sadness every time they think about it, but they've already learned the lesson it taught them. Would erasing just that memory improve their quality of life? Or would they always sense that something important was missing, even if they couldn't name it? The complexity of memory means that even removing a single moment could have ripple effects on other parts of a person's life. The science of memory complicates the dilemma even further. Memories aren't static. Every time we recall an event, our brains subtly alter it. Over time, memories become less accurate and more influenced by emotions, biases, and even new experiences. In some cases, the emotional weight of a bad memory can grow heavier simply because we've replayed it so many times. If this is true, does erasing the memory solve the problem? Or does it simply remove the chance to reinterpret and process it over time? There's also a moral dimension to the sleeping pill dilemma. If people had the ability to erase their bad memories, how would that change society? Would people take less responsibility for their actions, knowing they could simply forget the consequences? Would relationships become more fragile if people erased the pain of arguments or betrayals instead of working through them? On a larger scale, would entire communities choose to forget painful chapters of history rather than confront and learn from them? Memory isn't just personal. It's also collective. It shapes how we grow as individuals and as a society. The sleeping pill dilemma forces us to confront the nature of happiness. Is happiness the absence of pain, or is it something deeper? True happiness often comes from finding meaning, even in difficult times. A person who has experienced loss might still find joy in the memories of their loved one or in the resilience they built through grief. If they erased the pain, would the joy remain? Happiness and pain are often intertwined, making it hard to separate one from the other. Ultimately, the sleeping pill dilemma is about choice. Some people might choose to take the pill, valuing the relief it offers over the lessons and identity tied to their pain. Others might choose to keep their memories, no matter how painful, seeing them as essential to their growth and understanding of life. Neither choice is inherently right or wrong. It depends on the person and the nature of their experiences. The dilemma doesn't have a clear answer, and perhaps that's the point. It invites us to reflect on what it means to be human. We are shaped by our memories, yet we are not defined by them. We carry our pain, but we also find ways to heal and move forward. The sleeping pill may not exist in real life, but the questions it raises are real. Would you erase your pain if you could? Or would you choose to carry it, knowing it's part of who you are? That's a question only you can answer. The decision-making loop is a concept that reveals how our minds can get trapped in endless cycles of choice and indecision. It's what happens when you feel overwhelmed by options and can't commit to a decision, either because you fear making the wrong choice or because you constantly second-guess yourself. This loop doesn't just make decision-making harder, it can paralyze you entirely, leaving you stuck in a frustrating cycle of overthinking. Imagine standing in front of a row of vending machines, each stocked with different snacks. You're hungry and have money, but there are so many options. You start weighing the pros and cons of each snack. One is healthier, another is tastier, one is cheaper, and another is bigger. You think about what you'll regret more, choosing the wrong snack or missing out on a better one. Before you know it, 10 minutes have passed, and you still haven't pressed a button. This is a small example of the decision-making loop at work. What should be a simple task turns into a mental tug-of-war. The loop often starts with uncertainty. When faced with a decision, you want to make the best choice possible. This desire for perfection can lead you to overanalyze every detail, looking for the right answer. But many decisions don't have a single correct option. There are just different outcomes. Instead of accepting this, you might continue searching for the perfect solution, hoping to eliminate all doubt. As you do this, new factors or concerns might pop up, leading you to revisit the decision again and again. The process feeds itself, and you get stuck in the loop. Let's take another example, choosing a career path. Imagine a young adult trying to decide between becoming a doctor or an artist. Being a doctor offers stability and respect, but it requires years of study and dedication. Being an artist provides creative freedom, but comes with financial uncertainty. Instead of committing to one path, the person keeps debating. They might start researching what other people did, asking for advice, or reading articles about the pros and cons of both careers. Each new piece of information complicates the decision, pulling them further into the loop. Weeks or months later, they're no closer to making a choice, and the time spent debating feels wasted. This loop becomes more dangerous when the stakes are high or when time is limited. Imagine a soldier in combat who needs to decide whether to advance or retreat. Overthinking in this situation could cost lives. The same applies to firefighters, emergency room doctors, or anyone who works in high-pressure situations. They can't afford to get stuck in a decision-making loop because hesitation can have dire consequences. This is why professionals in these fields are trained to make quick, confident decisions based on the information they have in the moment. At its core, the decision-making loop is rooted in fear. Fear of failure, fear of regret, fear of the unknown. You might think, what if I make the wrong choice? What if something better is just around the corner? These thoughts can prevent you from committing to any decision at all. But ironically, not deciding is a decision in itself. By avoiding action, you're choosing to stay stuck, and this often leads to more frustration and anxiety than if you had simply made a choice and moved forward. One reason this loop is so hard to escape is that our brains crave certainty. We want to know we're making the right decision, but life rarely provides that kind of clarity. Most decisions involve trade-offs, and it's impossible to predict every outcome. For example, if you're deciding whether to move to a new city, you can research housing costs, job opportunities, and weather patterns, but you can't know exactly how it will feel to live there until you go. The desire for certainty can keep you trapped in a loop, constantly gathering more information but never taking action. Sometimes the decision-making loop is fueled by the abundance of choices in modern life. Psychologists call this choice overload. When you have too many options, it becomes harder to compare them all. Imagine shopping online for a new phone. You compare brands, models, reviews, prices, and features. Each option has its strengths and weaknesses, and as you continue to browse, new options keep appearing. The sheer number of choices can feel overwhelming, making it harder to commit to any one phone. This is why people often feel more satisfied with their decisions when they have fewer options to choose from. Breaking out of the decision-making loop requires a shift in mindset. First, it's important to accept that no decision is perfect. Every choice involves some level of risk or uncertainty. Instead of aiming for perfection, focus on making the best decision you can with the information you have. Recognize that it's okay to make mistakes. They're part of learning and growing. If you choose something and it doesn't work out, you can adjust course later. Another strategy is to set clear criteria for your decision. If you're buying a car, for example, decide in advance what features matter most to you, maybe safety, fuel efficiency, and price. Then evaluate each option based on those criteria, and once you find one that fits, commit to it. Setting limits can help you avoid endless comparisons and second-guessing. Sometimes it helps to impose a time limit on your decision. If you're debating what to eat for dinner, give yourself 5 minutes to decide. When the time is up, choose something and move on. This forces you to act and prevents the loop from taking over. For larger decisions like choosing a job or a house, you can set a deadline for when you'll stop researching and start deciding. Having a clear endpoint creates structure and reduces the tendency to overthink. Another useful approach is to reframe how you think about decisions. Instead of viewing them as permanent, life-altering choices, see them as opportunities to experiment. For example, if you're deciding whether to take a new job, remind yourself that you can always switch jobs again if it doesn't work out. Thinking of decisions as experiments reduces the pressure to get it right and makes it easier to move forward. Sometimes talking through your options with someone else can help you gain clarity. A friend or mentor might point out factors you hadn't considered or help you see the situation from a different perspective. Just be careful not to rely too much on others' opinions, as this can add more voices to the decision-making process and make the loop even more complicated. It's also helpful to recognize when your own emotions are keeping you stuck. Fear of regret, as mentioned earlier, is a powerful force in the decision-making loop. But regret is often based on the false belief that there's a perfect choice you missed. In reality, most decisions are more about trade-offs than perfection. Instead of focusing on what you might regret, try focusing on what you stand to gain. Shifting your mindset toward the positive can make it easier to take action. Ultimately, escaping the decision-making loop is about finding a balance between thought and action. Thinking through your options is important, but at some point you have to stop analyzing and take the leap. Action creates momentum, and even if the decision doesn't lead to the outcome you hoped for, it's better than staying stuck. Life is full of uncertainties, but progress comes from moving forward, not from standing still. The decision-making loop can feel like a trap, but with practice, you can break free and make choices with confidence. The concept of omnibenevolence, or being all-loving and perfectly good, is central to many discussions about the nature of a divine being. For centuries, philosophers and theologians have explored what it means for a deity to be omnibenevolent. While the idea is comforting to many, it raises deep and complex questions. One of the most significant conflicts lies in how omnibenevolence interacts with human free will and the existence of evil. If a deity is perfectly good, why does evil exist in the world? How can suffering and tragedy be reconciled with the idea of a loving and morally perfect creator? At the heart of the omnibenevolence conflict is a dilemma. On one hand, a perfectly good deity would presumably want to create a world free of suffering and evil. On the other hand, the world we live in is full of both. Pain and hardship touch every person in some form, and natural disasters, diseases, and human-made atrocities are a constant part of our history. This raises the question, if a deity is all-loving and all-powerful, why allow these things to happen? Couldn't such a being prevent suffering entirely? One common explanation appeals to the idea of free will. If humans are to have genuine free will, they must have the ability to make choices, including harmful ones. Free will allows for the possibility of good, but it also opens the door to evil. A world without free will might be free of suffering, but it would also lack meaningful human experiences. Love, courage, and kindness would lose their significance if they were compelled rather than chosen. From this perspective, the existence of evil is a necessary consequence of granting humans the freedom to choose their actions. However, this explanation doesn't fully address the issue. Even if free will accounts for human-caused suffering, it doesn't explain natural disasters or diseases. These forms of suffering seem unrelated to human choice. Why would a benevolent deity create a world where hurricanes, earthquakes, and illnesses can devastate lives? Some argue that these challenges are meant to test or strengthen humans, giving them opportunities to grow through adversity. While this may provide a partial explanation, it doesn't resolve the conflict entirely. A truly benevolent being could presumably create a world where growth and meaning are possible without the need for such immense suffering. Another approach to the problem is the idea that humans cannot fully understand the plans or nature of a divine being. From this perspective, the apparent conflict between omnibenevolence and the existence of suffering stems from our limited understanding. A deity might allow suffering for reasons beyond human comprehension. For example, what seems like unnecessary pain to us might serve a greater purpose that we cannot see. This argument suggests that trust in divine wisdom is necessary, even when it conflicts with our sense of justice or fairness. While this perspective offers a way to reconcile omnibenevolence with suffering, it raises additional questions. If we cannot understand the reasons for suffering, how can we confidently claim that a deity is benevolent in the first place? If divine goodness is beyond human understanding, then any attempt to describe or defend it becomes difficult. The very concept of omnibenevolence risks losing its meaning if it is entirely detached from human ideas of goodness. The omnibenevolence conflict also intersects with broader philosophical debates about the nature of morality. For example, does a deity determine what is good, or does goodness exist independently of any divine being? This question is at the heart of the Euthyphro Dilemma, an ancient philosophical problem posed by Plato. If something is good simply because a deity commands it, then goodness becomes arbitrary. On the other hand, if a deity commands something because it is inherently good, then goodness exists independently of the deity. In the context of omnibenevolence, this raises the question of whether a deity's goodness is absolute or subject to external standards. Some argue that the presence of suffering doesn't necessarily contradict omnibenevolence, but rather redefines it. From this perspective, a benevolent deity might allow temporary suffering to achieve greater long-term good. For example, a parent might allow a child to experience discomfort, such as a vaccination, to protect them from a worse outcome. In a similar way, suffering in the world might serve a purpose that ultimately contributes to a greater good. While this idea can be compelling, it still leaves unanswered questions. If a deity is both omnibenevolent and omnipotent, why not achieve the same greater good without the need for suffering? The omnibenevolence conflict also touches on the concept of justice. Many religious traditions describe a divine being who rewards good behavior and punishes wrongdoing. However, in practice, the world often seems unfair. Innocent people suffer, and those who commit harm often go unpunished. This apparent lack of justice is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a loving and morally perfect deity. Some argue that justice is delayed rather than absent, pointing to concepts like an afterlife or reincarnation where wrongs are made right. While this perspective offers hope, it relies on beliefs that cannot be proven, leaving the conflict unresolved for many. One of the most thought-provoking aspects of the omnibenevolence conflict is how it challenges us to think about the nature of goodness. Our understanding of what it means to be good is shaped by human experiences and limitations. A deity's goodness might operate on a completely different level, one that transcends our ability to comprehend. However, this raises the paradoxical question of whether goodness that is entirely incomprehensible to humans can still be called good in any meaningful sense. If divine goodness is so different from human morality that it allows for suffering, can we still relate to it or trust it? The omnibenevolence conflict does not have an easy resolution. It forces us to grapple with some of the most profound questions about existence, morality, and the nature of the universe. Whether or not one believes in a deity, the questions raised by this conflict are relevant to everyone. They challenge us to think critically about the meaning of goodness, the role of suffering in life, and the limits of human understanding. Ultimately, the omnibenevolence conflict highlights the tension between faith and reason. For those who believe in a benevolent deity, it may require an acceptance of mystery and a willingness to trust in the unseen. For those who question the existence of such a being, the conflict underscores the complexity of reconciling human experiences with abstract ideals. In either case, it invites deep reflection and ongoing dialogue, reminding us that some mysteries may never be fully resolved. The duck-rabbit problem is a thought experiment that challenges the way we perceive and interpret the world around us. At its core, it's about how the same image can be seen in two completely different ways, depending on how we choose to look at it. The famous drawing at the center of this problem is a simple line illustration. Some people see it as a duck, while others see it as a rabbit. The magic of the image is that it can be both, but not at the same time. You can flip between seeing the duck and the rabbit, but your brain cannot hold both interpretations simultaneously. This simple visual trick opens up deep questions about perception, reality, and how we make sense of the world. The image itself is straightforward. On one side, there's what appears to be a duck's bill, and on the other, two shapes that could easily be interpreted as rabbit ears. When someone first looks at the drawing, their brain immediately makes a decision about what it is. This decision is automatic and influenced by experience, context, and even cultural background. For instance, if you show the image during Easter, people might be more likely to see a rabbit. If it's near a pond or in a story about ducks, they might see a duck instead. The context surrounding the image can subtly nudge the mind in one direction without us even realizing it. The duck-rabbit problem was popularized by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein in his book Philosophical Investigations. Wittgenstein used the drawing to illustrate a key idea about how humans interpret the world. He argued that perception is not just about seeing, but also about interpreting what we see. When you look at the duck-rabbit image, your brain doesn't simply take in the visual information. Instead, it actively decides what the image is. This decision-making process happens so quickly that we often don't notice it. However, the duck-rabbit reminds us that what we see isn't always an objective truth. Instead, it's a combination of the raw data from our senses and the interpretations our minds impose on it. This raises an important question. How much of what we see is shaped by our expectations and assumptions? In the case of the duck-rabbit, you can switch your interpretation if someone points out the alternative view. If you see the duck first, someone might say, "But can you see the rabbit?" Suddenly, your brain makes a shift and the image changes. The drawing hasn't changed, but your perception of it has. This ability to flip between interpretations shows how flexible our minds can be. It also highlights how easily our perception can be influenced by external input. The duck-rabbit problem doesn't just apply to images. It's a metaphor for how we interpret the world in general. In life, we often encounter situations or ideas that can be seen in multiple ways. What looks like a problem to one person might be an opportunity to another. A decision that seems wise today might seem foolish in hindsight. The way we frame something, how we choose to see it, can completely change our experience of it. Just like the duck-rabbit, many things in life don't have a single, fixed meaning. Instead, they are open to interpretation. This idea can be applied to everyday situations. Imagine you're driving and someone cuts you off in traffic. Your first interpretation might be that the driver is rude or reckless. But what if there's another explanation? Maybe they're rushing to an emergency. The same event, a car cutting you off, can be seen in two very different ways depending on how you frame it. Like the duck-rabbit, the event itself doesn't change, but your interpretation of it does. This flexibility in perception is a powerful tool. It reminds us that we have the ability to shift our perspective and see things in a new light. The duck-rabbit problem also has implications for how we communicate with others. When two people disagree about something, it's often because they're interpreting the same situation in different ways. One person might see the duck, while the other sees the rabbit. Neither interpretation is wrong, but they are different. Recognizing this can help us approach disagreements with more empathy. Instead of insisting that our view is the only correct one, we can try to understand how someone else might see the same situation differently. This doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but it opens the door to better understanding. Psychologists have studied the duck-rabbit and similar images to explore how the brain works. These studies show that perception is not a passive process. Our brains don't simply record the world like a camera. Instead, they actively interpret and construct reality based on the information they receive. This process is influenced by past experiences, cultural norms, and even our current mood. For example, if someone is feeling happy, they might be more likely to see the duck-rabbit as something playful or interesting. If they're feeling frustrated, they might see it as confusing or irritating. This shows how deeply personal perception can be. The duck-rabbit problem also connects to bigger philosophical questions about reality. If two people can look at the same image and see different things, what does that say about the nature of reality itself? Is there an objective truth, or is everything a matter of interpretation? Wittgenstein used the duck-rabbit to argue that meaning is not inherent in objects, but is created by how we use and interpret them. This idea challenges the notion that there is a single, absolute way to view the world. Instead, it suggests that reality is more fluid and subjective than we might think. In a broader sense, the duck-rabbit problem encourages us to stay curious and open-minded. When we encounter something new, it's easy to rely on our first interpretation and assume it's correct. But the duck-rabbit reminds us that there might be another way to see things. By staying open to alternative perspectives, we can expand our understanding and appreciate the complexity of the world. This doesn't mean abandoning our own views, but it does mean recognizing that they are not the only ones. The duck-rabbit problem is a simple drawing, but it holds profound lessons about perception, interpretation, and the nature of reality. It shows us that what we see is not always what's there, and that the way we frame something can change its meaning entirely. Whether we're looking at an image, navigating a disagreement, or interpreting an event in our lives, the duck-rabbit reminds us to consider multiple perspectives. In doing so, we can better understand not only the world around us, but also the minds that shape how we see it. The circular time paradox is the idea that time might not flow in a straight line from the past to the future, but could instead loop back on itself, creating a cycle where the end of time becomes its beginning. It's a concept that challenges our understanding of time as something linear and sequential. If time is circular, questions arise about cause and effect, free will, and the nature of reality itself. These questions make the paradox as fascinating as it is difficult to resolve. We typically think of time as a line. You have a past, a present, and a future. Events happen in a sequence, one leads to the next. This linear view of time shapes how we think, act, and understand the world. It lets us organize events, plan for the future, and reflect on the past. However, not all cultures and philosophies view time this way. Many ancient civilizations, such as the Mayans and Hindus, believed in cycles of time, periods of creation, destruction, and rebirth that repeat endlessly. In these traditions, time isn't a straight path, but a circle, returning to the same point over and over. If time were circular, it would mean that every event we experience has already happened and will happen again. Imagine living your life, only to reach its end and find yourself starting over at the beginning without realizing it. You might think you're experiencing everything for the first time, but in reality, you're caught in a loop. This idea is central to Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche suggested that if time is infinite and events repeat, then everything you've ever done, every choice you've ever made, will happen again and again forever. This raises profound questions about the meaning of life and whether our actions have true significance. In a circular timeline, cause and effect become much harder to explain. Normally, we think of causes as preceding effects. If you drop a glass, it breaks. The act of dropping it causes the breaking. But if time is circular, what happens to this sequence? Does the breaking of the glass also lead to its being dropped, since the end of one cycle feeds into the beginning of the next? In a loop, it's not clear which came first, the cause or the effect. This challenges how we understand causality, making it difficult to pin down the origins of events. Consider a practical example. Imagine a scientist invents a time machine in the future. She travels back in time and shares her invention with her younger self. This younger version now knows how to build the time machine and grows up to become the scientist who invents it. In this scenario, who truly invented the time machine? The idea for the machine seems to have no origin. It exists because of the loop. This kind of self-sustaining cycle is called a bootstrap paradox and fits neatly into the concept of circular time. It highlights the strange consequences of events existing without a clear beginning or end. Another layer of complexity comes from the idea of free will. If time is circular, does that mean we are destined to repeat the same choices forever? Imagine deciding to take a different path in life, only to realize that your choice has already been made countless times before and will always lead to the same outcome. This can feel like a loss of control, as though we are actors in a play, repeating the same script endlessly. However, others argue that even in a loop, the choices we make still matter. If time repeats, then every moment is an opportunity to act with purpose and intention, regardless of whether it's been lived before. Circular time also raises questions about the universe itself. If time loops, what does that say about the nature of reality? Is the universe eternal, cycling endlessly without a beginning or end? Or does the loop itself have an origin, a point at which it began to circle? Physicists exploring theories about the universe's structure have speculated about models where time behaves cyclically. Some theories propose that the universe undergoes repeated cycles of expansion and contraction, big bangs followed by big crunches. In this view, our universe could be one iteration in an infinite series, with the events of each cycle echoing those of the last. Interestingly, modern physics doesn't rule out the possibility of circular time. Einstein's theory of general relativity allows for solutions where time loops back on itself. One example is the concept of closed time-like curves. These are paths through space-time that could theoretically allow someone to return to their own past. While these ideas remain speculative, they show that the notion of circular time isn't purely philosophical. It has a basis in scientific exploration. This paradox also connects to how we experience time on a personal level. Have you ever had a sense of déjà vu, the feeling that you've lived a moment before? While science often attributes this to memory quirks, some people wonder if it's a glimpse of circular time, a reminder that this moment has already happened. The sense of familiarity in these experiences feeds into the mystery of whether our lives might be part of an eternal cycle. Even literature and storytelling have explored circular time. Works like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five and Christopher Nolan's film Interstellar toy with the idea of non-linear time. These stories force us to think about what it means to live in a world where time doesn't follow a straight line. In Slaughterhouse-Five, for example, the protagonist becomes unstuck in time, experiencing moments from his life out of sequence. This fragmented view of time reflects the possibility that our linear perception might not capture the full picture. The circular time paradox remains unsolved, and perhaps it always will be. It challenges the way we think about beginnings and endings, about cause and effect, and about our own choices. If time loops endlessly, then the question of where it started might not have an answer. And if every moment is destined to repeat, it forces us to confront what truly gives life meaning. Is it the unique experiences we believe we have, or is it the value we assign to those moments, regardless of how often they occur? Ultimately, the paradox reminds us of the limits of human understanding. Time is something we experience constantly, yet its nature remains one of the greatest mysteries. Whether time is linear or circular, whether it flows endlessly forward or loops back on itself, it continues to defy our attempts to fully grasp it. Perhaps that's why the paradox endures. It speaks to the deepest questions we can ask about ourselves, our universe, and the nature of existence itself. The preference paradox is a thought experiment that challenges the way we think about our choices and freedom. It suggests that by always making what seems like the most rational or optimal choice, we may actually lose the essence of true freedom. At first glance, this idea seems counterintuitive. Isn't freedom about being able to choose what we want, when we want? But the paradox reveals a deeper issue. If our preferences are entirely shaped by external factors or internal logic, are we truly free, or are we just following a predetermined path? Imagine a person standing in front of two doors. One leads to a room filled with all their favorite things: comfortable furniture, delicious food, and entertainment they enjoy. The other door leads to a completely random experience. It could be better, worse, or simply different from what they are used to. A rational person would likely choose the first door because it guarantees comfort and happiness based on what they know they like. But what happens when they keep making this choice over and over? By always selecting what is familiar and comfortable, they may unknowingly trap themselves in a bubble of predictable experiences. They never explore the unknown, and their preferences begin to define and limit their world. Now consider how preferences are formed. People often believe their choices are entirely their own, but preferences are shaped by upbringing, culture, and environment. For example, someone who grows up eating a specific cuisine might prefer those flavors as an adult. Their preference feels personal, but it's rooted in their background. Similarly, societal trends influence what people find attractive, valuable, or desirable. A preference for one thing over another might feel like a free choice, but it could be the result of years of conditioning. If preferences are shaped by external forces, are we truly making free decisions when we follow them? The paradox becomes even clearer when we think about optimization. In today's world, people are encouraged to make the best choices, whether it's in their careers, relationships, or even their leisure activities. Technology plays a big role in this. Algorithms on streaming platforms, shopping sites, and social media recommend content based on past preferences. These recommendations often feel helpful because they align with what we already like. But over time, they narrow our experiences. If every movie you watch is recommended based on your past choices, you might never discover a film outside your comfort zone. The same applies to music, books, or even news. The effort to optimize every choice can create a feedback loop where your world becomes smaller and less diverse. This leads to a question. Is following our preferences always the right thing to do? The preference paradox suggests that it's not. True freedom might require stepping outside of what feels natural or logical. It means choosing something not because it's the best option, but because it's different. By doing so, we expose ourselves to new experiences, ideas, and possibilities that could reshape our preferences altogether. Imagine someone who always prefers one genre of music but decides to attend a concert in a completely different style. They might discover they enjoy it, expanding their world in ways they couldn't have predicted. A famous philosophical thought experiment helps illustrate this point. Imagine a machine that can perfectly simulate any experience you desire. You can plug into this machine and live out your ideal life, a life filled with pleasure, satisfaction, and success. Most people would hesitate to use the machine because they know the experiences wouldn't be real. Even though the machine fulfills every preference, something feels wrong about giving up the unpredictability of real life. This thought experiment shows that people value more than just satisfying their preferences. They value the freedom to explore, change, and grow, even if it means facing uncertainty. The preference paradox also highlights the role of spontaneity. Some of life's best moments come from unexpected choices. Think about meeting a new friend, finding a hidden spot on a road trip, or trying an activity you never thought you'd enjoy. These moments happen not because they align with your existing preferences, but because you stepped outside of them. If we always act rationally, based on what we think we like, we risk missing out on these serendipitous experiences. At the heart of the paradox is the tension between rationality and freedom. Rationality tells us to optimize our choices, to do what makes sense based on what we know about ourselves. Freedom, on the other hand, involves the ability to make choices that don't always follow logic. It's about embracing the unknown and the unpredictable. The paradox suggests that true freedom requires a balance between the two. It's not about rejecting preferences altogether, but recognizing when they limit us and choosing to step beyond them. This idea has practical implications for how we live our lives. It challenges us to question our habits and routines. Why do we make the choices we make? Are they truly ours, or are they shaped by external influences? Are we stuck in patterns that feel comfortable but prevent growth? By asking these questions, we can become more aware of the forces shaping our preferences and begin to take control of them. For example, consider someone who always orders the same dish at their favorite restaurant. They enjoy it, so it feels like the logical choice. But what if they tried something new? They might not like it as much, but they might also discover a new favorite. The point isn't to abandon what we like, but to leave room for exploration. Life becomes richer when we allow ourselves to be surprised. Another example is in relationships. People often gravitate toward others who share similar interests and values. While this creates comfort and compatibility, it can also limit growth. By connecting with people who challenge our views or come from different backgrounds, we expand our understanding of the world. These relationships might not align with our initial preferences, but they can lead to profound personal growth. The preference paradox also applies to decision-making on a larger scale. In a society that values efficiency and optimization, there's a tendency to prioritize short-term gains over long-term exploration. Companies might focus on products they know will sell instead of taking risks on innovative ideas. Governments might favor policies that maintain stability over those that challenge the status quo. While these choices make sense in the moment, they can stifle creativity and progress. The paradox reminds us that freedom and growth often come from the unexpected. It encourages us to embrace uncertainty and see value in the unfamiliar. This doesn't mean abandoning all preferences or logic. It means recognizing when our preferences become a cage and choosing to break free. Ultimately, the preference paradox invites us to rethink what it means to live freely. It shows us that true freedom isn't about always making the best or most logical choice. It's about the ability to step beyond our preferences, to explore new possibilities, and to embrace the unknown. By doing so, we create a life that is richer, more diverse, and more meaningful. The Twin Earth thought experiment is a fascinating way to explore the relationship between meaning, language, and perception. It was proposed by philosopher Hilary Putnam in 1975 to challenge how we think about meaning and reference in language. At its core, the experiment asks a simple yet profound question: how does the meaning of a word depend on the world we live in? By imagining a hypothetical scenario, the thought experiment reveals deep insights into how our minds interact with the external world and how meaning is tied to context. To understand the thought experiment, imagine there are two planets, Earth and Twin Earth. Twin Earth is identical to Earth in almost every way. The geography, climate, and even the people are exactly the same. There is only one key difference. On Twin Earth, what looks and functions like water is not H2O. Instead, it is made of a different chemical compound, which we will call XYZ. This Twin Earth water behaves like regular water. It is clear, drinkable, and fills the oceans, rivers, and lakes, but its chemical structure is completely different from the water we know on Earth. On Twin Earth, the word water refers to XYZ, while on Earth, it refers to H2O. Now imagine a person living on Earth in 1750, before anyone knew about chemical structures. At that time, people on Earth and Twin Earth would both use the word water to describe the clear, drinkable liquid they encounter in daily life. Neither group would know that the substances are chemically distinct. Despite this, Putnam argues that when people on Earth say water, they are referring specifically to H2O, and when people on Twin Earth say water, they are referring to XYZ. This suggests that the meaning of water is not determined only by what people know or believe, but also by the underlying nature of the substance in their environment. The thought experiment reveals a key idea. Meaning is partly determined by external reality, not just by our thoughts or definitions. When we say water, we are referring to the actual chemical substance H2O, even if we don't consciously know its chemical composition. This concept challenges the notion that meaning exists entirely in the mind. Instead, it suggests that meaning is a combination of internal understanding and external facts. To make this clearer, consider another example. Imagine two people, one on Earth and one on Twin Earth, pointing to a glass of liquid and saying, "This is water." From their perspectives, they are both correct. The liquids they are describing look and feel identical. However, the meaning of their words is different because the substances are chemically distinct. The Earth person's water refers to H2O, while the Twin Earth person's water refers to XYZ. The experiment shows that even when experiences and appearances are the same, the meaning of words can differ because of the underlying reality. This thought experiment also raises questions about how language evolves. In 1750, people on Earth didn't know that water was H2O. They used the word water to describe a clear, drinkable liquid. But once scientists discovered its chemical structure, the meaning of water became tied to H2O. This means that scientific knowledge can shape the meaning of words over time. The same would be true on Twin Earth. When Twin Earth scientists discovered that their water was XYZ, the meaning of their word water would become tied to its unique chemical structure. Putnam's experiment also challenges the idea of meaning as something that is purely in our minds. It suggests that meaning is not only about what we think, but also about the world we live in. For example, if an Earth scientist were to visit Twin Earth and examine their water, they would discover that it is chemically different from H2O. Even though it looks and functions the same, it is not the same substance. This demonstrates that meaning depends on both perception and external reality. Our understanding of the world is shaped by the things we interact with, and these interactions influence the words we use and their meanings. The thought experiment also has implications for identity and uniqueness. If Earth and twin Earth are identical in every way, except for the composition of water, does this make them fundamentally different worlds? At first glance, the difference might seem small, but it reveals how even minor variations in reality can have a significant impact on meaning. This invites us to think about how much of our identity and understanding is shaped by the specific environment we live in. For example, consider a scenario where someone from Earth moves to twin Earth. They might initially think the twin Earth water is the same as what they knew on Earth. Over time, though, they might learn about the chemical difference and come to see XYZ as distinct from H2O. This change in understanding reflects how closely meaning is tied to context. The twin Earth thought experiment encourages us to think about the limits of our knowledge and how meaning evolves as we learn more about the world. One of the most thought-provoking aspects of this experiment is its relevance to modern questions about language and technology. In a world where artificial intelligence and machine learning systems process language, the twin Earth scenario highlights the importance of context. A machine might recognize the word water, but fail to grasp its deeper meaning if it doesn't understand the difference between H2O and XYZ. This shows how critical it is to connect language to the reality it describes. The twin Earth thought experiment also touches on questions about reality and perception. If two substances look and behave identically but are chemically different, does this distinction matter in everyday life? On one hand, people on both Earth and twin Earth would experience their respective waters in the same way. They would drink it, cook with it, and use it to sustain life. On the other hand, the difference in chemical composition makes the substances fundamentally distinct. This tension between appearance and reality challenges us to think about what truly defines something. In essence, the twin Earth thought experiment invites us to question how meaning is created and how it changes over time. It shows that meaning is not just about what we think or believe, but also about the world we interact with. By imagining a world so similar yet slightly different from our own, we gain new insights into the nature of language, knowledge, and reality. The experiment doesn't provide definitive answers, but it encourages us to think deeply about the connections between our minds, our words, and the world around us. In doing so, it reveals the complex and fascinating relationship between meaning and reality. The Paradox of Hedonism explores a simple yet perplexing truth. The more directly you pursue happiness, the less likely you are to find it. This idea seems counterintuitive. After all, isn't happiness something we all strive for? Shouldn't focusing on it lead us closer to achieving it? The paradox suggests otherwise, showing how the relentless pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction often leads to disappointment or emptiness. To understand the paradox, consider what happiness means. For many, happiness involves positive emotions, fulfillment, or a sense of contentment. These states, however, are often byproducts of other actions rather than something we can manufacture on demand. Think about laughter. It arises naturally in the moment, often from humor or joy. You cannot force yourself to laugh genuinely if there's nothing funny. Similarly, happiness is often a response to external or internal experiences, rather than something we can chase and grab. Imagine someone whose main goal in life is to be happy. They structure every decision, every action, around maximizing their pleasure. They avoid challenges or commitments that might inconvenience them. They seek only the things that bring immediate gratification. While this might sound appealing on the surface, it often leads to dissatisfaction. Life becomes shallow and repetitive when everything revolves around chasing fleeting pleasures. The paradox lies in the realization that happiness often emerges not from chasing it directly, but from engaging in meaningful activities or pursuing goals outside of oneself. Take relationships as an example. If someone approaches a friendship or romantic relationship solely to make themselves happy, the dynamic often becomes self-centered. They may constantly assess whether the relationship is bringing them enough joy, rather than focusing on the needs of the other person or the connection itself. Ironically, this constant evaluation can erode the very bond that could have brought deep, genuine happiness. Relationships thrive when we prioritize others, show care, and invest in shared experiences. Happiness becomes a natural result of these actions rather than the central aim. The same applies to work and achievements. Consider someone who pursues a career solely for the promise of happiness. They might choose a job they think will make them happy, such as one with a high salary or minimal stress, but over time, they find it unfulfilling. Without a deeper sense of purpose or connection to the work, the joy they anticipated doesn't arrive. Compare this to someone who pursues a career out of passion or a desire to contribute something meaningful. The focus shifts from happiness to purpose, and happiness often follows as a result. The philosopher John Stuart Mill articulated this paradox well. He believed that happiness cannot be obtained by directly seeking it. Instead, it arises as a side effect of pursuing other goals. Mill observed that people who devote themselves to meaningful endeavors, whether it's a cause, a creative pursuit, or helping others, often find themselves happier than those who focus solely on their own pleasure. By turning attention outward, happiness finds its way inward. The paradox also reveals itself in the context of pleasure. Short-term pleasures, like eating a favorite dessert or buying something new, can bring a brief boost of happiness. But when we rely too heavily on these pleasures, their impact diminishes over time. Psychologists refer to this as hedonic adaptation. Once the initial thrill fades, we return to our baseline level of happiness, often leaving us wanting more. Chasing pleasure in this way can become a cycle, where each new pursuit feels less satisfying than the last. A practical example is the difference between material possessions and experiences. Studies consistently show that experiences, like traveling, spending time with loved ones, or learning something new, bring more lasting happiness than buying things. This is because experiences connect us to others, help us grow, and create memories that remain meaningful over time. Material possessions, on the other hand, quickly lose their novelty, leaving us craving the next purchase. Again, the paradox appears. Happiness grows not from trying to have more, but from living fully in ways that enrich our lives. Another layer to the paradox is how happiness often involves effort or sacrifice. Think of training for a marathon. The process is physically demanding and often uncomfortable. Yet, when the race is completed, the sense of accomplishment and pride can be profound. Similarly, raising a child or working on a difficult project can involve stress, fatigue, and frustration. But these experiences are also some of the most rewarding because they connect us to a sense of purpose. In contrast, avoiding effort in favor of constant ease often leads to boredom or a sense of stagnation. Happiness also depends on how we perceive it. When we obsess over whether we're happy enough, we often become less satisfied. This constant self-monitoring can make even good experiences feel insufficient. For instance, someone might plan a dream vacation with the sole purpose of being happy. If they spend the trip analyzing whether they're having enough fun, they may miss the moments of joy happening around them. Happiness flourishes when we're present and engaged, not when we constantly measure it. The paradox of hedonism doesn't mean we should ignore happiness altogether. Instead, it challenges us to think differently about how we pursue it. Rather than chasing happiness directly, we can focus on the things that make life meaningful. Building relationships, contributing to others, engaging in hobbies, and pursuing goals that align with our values. By shifting our attention away from happiness as the primary goal, we often find it in unexpected ways. This idea aligns with ancient philosophies like Stoicism and Buddhism. Both emphasize the importance of living in harmony with one's values and accepting life's challenges rather than seeking constant pleasure. Stoics believe that true happiness comes from virtue, not external rewards. Buddhists teach that attachment to pleasure leads to suffering, and that inner peace comes from letting go of the need to always feel happy. These perspectives remind us that the pursuit of happiness often involves stepping back from the chase. In modern psychology, the concept of flow illustrates this idea well. Flow occurs when we're fully immersed in an activity, whether it's playing music, painting, or solving a problem. During flow, we lose track of time and focus entirely on the task. Paradoxically, these moments of intense engagement are often when people feel happiest. They're not thinking about happiness at all. They're simply absorbed in what they're doing. This reinforces the idea that happiness is a byproduct of meaningful activity, not the result of chasing pleasure directly. The paradox of hedonism encourages us to reevaluate our approach to life. It shows that happiness is less about the pursuit itself and more about the journey, about how we live, connect, and grow. It's not that happiness is unimportant, it's that it flourishes when we're focused on something greater than ourselves. By embracing this paradox, we can live fuller, richer lives where happiness is not the goal, but a natural companion along the way.